Picture a life where you walk past gleaming skyscrapers each day, their glass and steel monuments to fortunes beyond imagination, yet you turn down a narrow alley into a world of corrugated metal roofs and open drains. Imagine a person who could buy entire city blocks, choosing instead to sleep on a thin mat in a single room, surrounded by the very poverty they have the power to eradicate with a single signature. This is not a work of fiction, but the breathtaking reality for a handful of the world's most enigmatic billionaires. Today, we are pulling back the curtain on one of history's most fascinating paradoxes: the ultra-wealthy who, by deliberate choice or a twist of cruel fate, have lived in genuine, soul-testing poverty. These are not just stories of eccentricity. They are profound narratives about the human spirit, about what happens when unimaginable wealth collides with the raw, unfiltered experience of having nothing at all. We are about to journey into the shadows cast by immense fortunes, to meet individuals whose lives became a living contradiction, forcing us to question everything we think we know about money, identity, and the very meaning of a well-lived life. What kind of person willingly gives up a life of private jets and penthouse suites for the hardship of a slum? Is it a search for meaning, a twisted form of penance, or a profound spiritual quest that mere money cannot fulfill? And for those who were thrust into poverty by circumstance, their fortunes hidden or stolen away, what does it reveal about the fragility of wealth and the resilience required to claw your way back from the absolute bottom? These tales stretch from the gilded ballrooms of forgotten heiresses to the ruthless corporate battles that left titans of industry penniless overnight. They are stories of survival that are as much about internal fortitude as they are about external drama, filled with secret identities, double lives, and fortunes so well hidden they were almost lost to time. This is the realm where royal scandals intersect with rags to riches stories played in reverse, a world where the lines between privilege and plight are not just blurred, but completely erased. So prepare to step into a narrative that defies all conventional logic. We will explore the psychological depths of these individuals, unpack the astonishing circumstances that led them to inhabit two diametrically opposed worlds simultaneously, and discover what their extraordinary lives can teach us about our own values and desires. This is a journey into the heart of a great human mystery, a deep dive into the lives of those who had it all, yet chose, or were forced, to live with nothing. It's a story of hidden fortunes and revealed truths, and it all starts now. To truly understand this paradox, we must travel back to the Gilded Age, a period dripping with ostentatious wealth, and meet a woman who defied every single convention of her time. In an era where the Vanderbilts and Astors were building palaces and hosting lavish balls, Hetty Green stood apart, not for her extravagance, but for her almost pathological thrift. She was known to the press as the Witch of Wall Street, a title that speaks volumes about the fear and fascination she inspired. Yet behind that sensationalist nickname was a financial genius who, at her peak, was considered the richest woman in America, with a fortune equivalent to billions in today's dollars. What makes her story so compelling is the stark chasm between her immense wealth and the desperately impoverished existence she chose for herself and her family. Hetty Green didn't just practice frugality. She elevated it to an art form, a philosophy, and some would argue, a form of self-punishment. Her daily life was a masterclass in minimalism, but this wasn't the trendy, curated kind we see today. It was a harsh, unyielding reality. She famously wore the same heavy, ragged black dress every single day, letting it fade and wear thin until it was little more than a threadbare rag. When it became too soiled, she would not buy a new one. Instead, she would merely turn the dress inside out, presenting a slightly cleaner side to the world. She lived not in a mansion, but in a series of low-rent boarding houses and cramped, sparsely furnished apartments in Brooklyn and Hoboken, moving frequently to avoid establishing residency and paying taxes. Her meals were often cold oatmeal, which she heated on the radiator to save on fuel costs. There's a famous and perhaps apocryphal story that illustrates her priorities with chilling clarity. When her young son, Ned, injured his knee, she allegedly disguised herself as a beggar to seek free treatment at a charity clinic. The delay in proper medical care led to a severe infection, and his leg ultimately had to be amputated. For Hetty, the agony of spending money was seemingly greater than the agony of her own child. But to dismiss Hetty Green as a simple miser is to miss the profound brilliance that fueled her empire. Her poverty was not born from a lack of resources, but from a deep-seated, almost religious belief in the sanctity of capital. She saw spending as a weakness, a failure of discipline. Every dollar saved was a dollar that could be put to work, and work it did. She was a savant of the financial markets, inheriting a substantial sum from her family and then multiplying it exponentially through sheer intellect and nerve. She voraciously read the financial papers, analyzed balance sheets, and possessed an uncanny instinct for market cycles. While the men of Wall Street chased risky speculation, Hetty practiced what we would now call value investing, buying up bonds and mortgages during financial panics when everyone else was selling in a blind fear. She became the banker to the banks, a lender of last resort to major institutions, and even the city of New York itself, all while she haggled over the price of a newspaper. Her mind operated on two distinct planes, one that could orchestrate multi-million-dollar deals with cool precision, and another that was consumed by the cost of a postage stamp. This incredible duality forces us to look beyond simple greed. Her behavior was rooted in a traumatic childhood lesson. Her family was Quaker, a faith that valued plain living and hard work. But the real formative event was watching her aunt squander a fortune on a lavish lifestyle. Hetty internalized a terrifying truth. Money could disappear. It was fragile. And so she built a fortress around her wealth, not with marble and gold, but with an impenetrable wall of frugality. Her self-imposed poverty was, in her mind, the ultimate insurance policy. It was a performance of poverty that proved her mastery over money, a constant, living demonstration that she was not controlled by her fortune, but was its absolute commander. In the glittering, wasteful Gilded Age, Hetty Green was a stark, sobering monument to a different kind of power. The power of relentless accumulation and the profound fear of loss that can haunt even the richest person alive. To truly grasp the psychology of Hetty Green, we must move beyond the simple label of miser and venture into the complex terrain of her past. The roots of her extreme behavior are often traced to a single, defining childhood moment. As a young girl, she watched her own aunt fritter away a significant inheritance on a life of frivolous luxury, a spectacle that imprinted upon her a permanent and terrifying lesson. Wealth was not a stable foundation, but a fleeting resource that could vanish in an instant if not guarded with absolute vigilance. This experience was then compounded by the strict Quaker principles of her family, which championed plain living and thrift. But for Hetty, these values became twisted into an all-consuming obsession. The fear of poverty wasn't just a distant concern. It was a phantom that haunted her every waking moment, a psychological specter so powerful that self-inflicted poverty became her only perceived defense against it. Her frugality was a fortress, and every dollar she refused to spend was another brick in its wall. This deeply ingrained anxiety manifested in ways that transcended mere eccentricity and crossed into the realm of genuine tragedy, most shockingly illustrated by the story of her son, Ned. When the boy suffered a severe knee injury, his mother's first instinct was not to rush him to the finest surgeon, a service she could have easily afforded 100 times over. Instead, her mind immediately calculated the cost. She reportedly dressed in her oldest, most tattered clothes and took him to a free charity clinic, attempting to pass themselves off as paupers. The initial misdiagnosis and subsequent infections that followed this delay in proper medical care were so severe that doctors were ultimately left with no choice but to amputate the young boy's leg. This single heartbreaking anecdote reveals a mind so dominated by the fear of financial loss that it overrode even the most fundamental of human instincts, the protection of one's own child. For Hetty, the immediate, tangible agony of parting with money was viscerally more painful than the abstract, future suffering of her son. It's a decision that seems monstrous to an outside observer, yet within her distorted psychological framework, it was a perfectly logical act of preservation. Her relationship with money was not just about hoarding. It was also about control, a fact brutally demonstrated in her relentless legal battles over her father's estate. When her father's will left a substantial portion of his fortune to charitable causes and other relatives, Hetty launched a ferocious, decades-long campaign of litigation. She fought her own family through the court systems with a tenacity that became legendary, challenging every clause and codicil with a brilliant, legalistic mind. This wasn't merely about acquiring more wealth. It was about asserting her right to what she believed was inherently hers. The lawsuits became an extension of her psychological need for total dominion over her financial world. Losing a single dollar to a relative or a charity was an intolerable crack in the fortress walls, an admission that her control was not absolute. These battles consumed immense amounts of time and, ironically, legal fees. But for Hetty, the principle was paramount. Winning in court validated her entire worldview, that she, and she alone, was the rightful master of the fortune she guarded so jealously. Ultimately, Hetty Green's story is a profound case study in how trauma and fear can warp even the most brilliant mind. She was a financial genius operating in a man's world, a woman who outthought and outmaneuvered the titans of Wall Street. Yet, that same formidable intellect was imprisoned by a terror so powerful that it compelled her to inhabit a life of calculated deprivation. Her self-imposed poverty was not a sign of a lack of wealth, but rather the ultimate proof of its power over her. She lived in a state of constant, proactive defense, believing that by already living as if she were poor, she could never truly become so. This paradoxical strategy, where embracing poverty was the only way to feel secure from it, created a human being who was simultaneously one of the most powerful and one of the most pitiable figures of her age, a walking contradiction whose life forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the greatest poverty is not a lack of money, but a scarcity of peace. While the world knew Hetty Green for her performative and anxious frugality, the 20th century would present an even more enigmatic figure, a woman whose relationship with wealth was not defined by public displays of penny pinching, but by an almost absolute retreat from the world her fortune built. If Hetty was the Witch of Wall Street, then Huguette Clark was its ghost. Born in 1906, she was the daughter of one of the most formidable tycoons of the Gilded Age, Senator William Andrews Clark, a man whose wealth from copper mines, railroads, and banking was so vast that he was rumored to be one of the richest Americans in history. Huguette was raised in an atmosphere of almost unimaginable opulence, splitting her childhood between a 121-room Beaux Arts mansion on Fifth Avenue in New York City, a sprawling estate in Connecticut, and a colossal California retreat overlooking the Pacific Ocean. She was the quintessential heiress presented at court, painted by society portraitists, and immersed in a world of limitless privilege. Yet, at the height of her life, she made a choice that would baffle society for decades. She simply vanished. Her withdrawal was not a sudden event, but a gradual fading. After a brief, annulled marriage in the late 1920s, Huguette began to retreat from the public eye. By the 1960s, she had ceased making public appearances entirely. For the last 20 years of her life, she lived not in any of her palatial homes, but in a series of simple, Spartan rooms in New York City hospitals. This was not due to a dire medical necessity, but seemingly by choice. Her primary residence became a plain hospital room, its walls bare, its furnishings functional. Meanwhile, just a few miles away, her magnificent Fifth Avenue apartment, a 42-room time capsule filled with priceless French antiques, a world-class collection of paintings by masters like Renoir and Monet, and even a Stradivarius violin, sat completely empty, shrouded in dust sheets, maintained but uninhabited for over half a century. It was a life lived in staggering contradiction. A woman surrounded by the ultimate symbols of culture and luxury, choosing to exist in an environment of stark, institutional simplicity. What could possibly drive a person to such an extreme act of abandonment? The theories are as numerous as they are fascinating. Some speculated it was the trauma of her early, failed marriage that made her distrustful of the world. Others pointed to a deep-seated shyness, an innate personality that was overwhelmed by the glare of public attention and the burden of her family name. There were whispers of a controlling mother who instilled in her a profound fear of the outside world. But the most compelling explanation lies in the nature of the wealth itself. Huguette's father, Senator Clark, was a notoriously ruthless and controversial figure, a robber baron accused of buying his seat in the Senate and crushing his competitors without mercy. His fortune was born in the cutthroat battles of industry, and it is possible that Huguette felt the weight of that history, a psychic burden attached to every dollar. For her, the mansions and the masterpieces may not have represented beauty and comfort, but rather monuments to a brutal, complicated legacy she wished to escape. Her hospital room, by contrast, was neutral territory. It held no history, no expectations, and no ghosts. Yet, to view Huguette Clark as merely a recluse is to ignore the vibrant, secret life she led from her self-imposed exile. Within those hospital walls, she was not simply waiting to die. She was actively, creatively living. She became an avid painter, creating hundreds of delicate watercolors, often of flowers and Japanese-inspired scenes. She developed a passionate interest in anime, building an extensive collection of dolls and corresponding regularly with Japanese artists. She maintained deep, long-distance friendships, primarily through the telephone, speaking for hours with those she trusted. And perhaps most tellingly, she was extraordinarily generous, quietly donating millions of dollars to individuals she befriended, from hospital staff to strangers whose stories touched her, and to charitable causes, all while remaining completely anonymous. This suggests that her retreat was not a rejection of humanity, but a redefinition of her relationship with it. She was not hoarding her wealth like Hetty Green. She was actively using it to connect with a world she could no longer bear to physically inhabit, crafting a life of meaning on her own terms, far from the gilded cages of her inheritance. Her poverty was not one of finances, but of physical space and social contact, a deliberate trade she made to purchase something she valued more highly: peace, control, and the freedom to be herself, unseen. Huguette Clark's life was a study in profound, enduring contrasts, a reality that becomes almost palpable when we step inside the homes she left behind. While she resided in those stark hospital rooms, her 3 magnificent properties stood frozen in time, monuments to a world she had physically abandoned but could never fully let go. Her Fifth Avenue apartment was perhaps the most astonishing, a sprawling 42-room home occupying an entire floor of a prestigious building, yet it had not seen a single occupant in over 50 years. The space was a time capsule from the 1920s, filled with the very finest things money could buy: gilded French furniture, silk-covered walls, and a legendary collection of fine art that included masterpieces by Monet and Renoir. In another of her homes, a vast California estate, rooms were filled with an entirely different kind of treasure: thousands upon thousands of rare and exquisite dolls. She owned one of the most comprehensive doll collections in the world, featuring antique French models, intricate Japanese creations, and custom-made dolls with hand-stitched costumes, all displayed in elaborate miniature settings she had lovingly designed. These were not just objects. They were inhabitants of a silent, perfect world she had curated and then walked away from. This creates a bewildering psychological puzzle. Here was a woman who funded the meticulous upkeep of these palaces, paying staff to dust the artwork, maintain the climate control, and ensure everything remained precisely as she had left it. Yet she herself chose to live in a space devoid of any personal luxury. It was as if she needed to know that her beautiful, perfect world still existed, a kind of safety net of beauty and order, even if she could no longer bear to live within it. Her hospital room was her anchor to a manageable, predictable reality, a place free from the overwhelming responsibility and memory embedded in every antique chair and oil painting. The mansions and their contents became an externalized museum of her inner life, a life of immense potential and creativity that she ultimately found too vast and demanding to inhabit. She could control their preservation from a distance, an act that granted her a sense of power without the burden of direct engagement. The full complexity of her hidden world only truly came to light after her death in 2011, at the remarkable age of 104. With no immediate heirs, her last wishes, detailed in a will she signed just 6 weeks after another, became the catalyst for an explosive legal drama that pitted her distant relatives against the hospital executives, accountants, and nurses who had been her closest companions in her final years. The later will disinherited nearly all of her family, leaving the vast majority of her estate, valued at over $300 million, to a new arts foundation and making multi-million-dollar bequests to her private nurse, her doctor, her accountant, and even the hospital where she lived. Her relatives immediately contested this, arguing that the elderly, reclusive heiress had been manipulated and was not of sound mind when she signed the documents, painting a picture of a vulnerable woman isolated and influenced by those who stood to gain enormous wealth. The ensuing court battle dragged on for years, pulling back the curtain on Huguette's secret life in a way she had always avoided. Her extensive phone records were examined, her personal correspondence was scrutinized, and those who had known her best were forced to testify about her mental state and motivations. The case forced the public to confront the same paradox we are exploring. Was this a sharp, independent woman making conscious, deliberate choices about her legacy? Or was she a victim, a prisoner not just of a hospital room, but of the very people she trusted? In the end, after a massive and costly legal fight, a settlement was reached. The family received a significant portion of the estate, while the foundation and the named beneficiaries also received substantial sums. But the resolution could never truly answer the deeper questions about Huguette's intentions. Her story leaves us with an unresolved tension between autonomy and influence, between eccentricity and exploitation, a haunting reminder that even the most carefully constructed private world can be shattered by the demands of the fortune that built it. While Huguette Clark chose to retreat from her fortune into a world of quiet isolation, another story from the annals of American wealth presents a different kind of paradox altogether. This one involves not a rejection of wealth, but a carefully engineered upbringing designed to forge a billionaire's heir through the discipline of deprivation. To understand this, we must turn our attention to the most powerful dynasty of them all, the Rockefellers. And at the heart of this story is John Davison Rockefeller Jr., the only son of the world's first billionaire. His early life was not one of unrestrained privilege, but rather a form of meticulously controlled poverty, a psychological experiment orchestrated by his formidable father to ensure the family fortune would not spoil its inheritor. Imagine being raised in the shadow of unprecedented wealth, in a home where the very concept of financial limit was invented daily, yet being forced to live by a set of rules stricter than those governing most middle-class households. This was the reality for Junior. The architect of this regime was, of course, John D. Rockefeller Sr., a man whose name became synonymous with both industrial might and austere personal habits. Having built Standard Oil into a globe-spanning monopoly, Rockefeller possessed a fortune so vast it was almost incomprehensible. Yet, he was also a devout Northern Baptist, a man who believed that idle wealth was a moral sin and that financial discipline was next to godliness. He applied this philosophy to his children with relentless consistency. From a very young age, Junior and his 4 sisters were subjected to what can only be described as a boot camp for frugality. Each child was given a tiny allowance, just a few cents a week, and this pittance was not for frivolous spending. It came with a set of rigorous account books, small ledgers where every single cent had to be meticulously recorded, earned, spent, saved, and given to charity. This was more than just a lesson in budgeting. It was a complete system of moral and financial conditioning. The children were paid for their chores, staking 10 potatoes, killing 10 flies, sharpening pencils, and failure to perform a task meant a fine was deducted from their meager earnings. There were no unrestricted gifts of money, no lavish treats, no sense of a bottomless financial well to draw from. Junior famously recalled that he did not see his first theatrical performance until he was away at college, and he never even learned to ride a bicycle because his father considered it an extravagance. He wore his elder sister's hand-me-down dresses as a young boy, a practice that continued until he was about 8 years old. This was life inside the Rockefeller household, a world where the son of the wealthiest man on the planet was dressed in used clothing and paid pennies for killing flies, all under the watchful eye of a father who demanded a perfect balance in a child's ledger. The psychological impact of this upbringing was profound and lasting. On one hand, it instilled in Junior a deep-seated aversion to waste and a powerful sense of financial responsibility. He never developed the reckless, spendthrift habits that destroyed so many other Gilded Age fortunes. This ingrained caution became the bedrock of his life. He was notoriously careful with money, scrutinizing every personal and philanthropic expense with an intensity that sometimes baffled his associates. Yet, on the other hand, this harsh discipline came at a significant personal cost. Throughout his life, Junior was plagued by self-doubt, anxiety, and what he described as periods of nervous exhaustion. The immense pressure to be worthy of his father's fortune, to justify his existence through relentless work and impeccable morality, weighed heavily on him. He was being groomed not to enjoy the fortune, but to serve as its ordained steward, a role that demanded the suppression of personal desire in favor of duty. This unique combination of immense financial power and deeply ingrained frugality is what ultimately shaped his monumental legacy. The same man who hesitated over small personal expenditures would go on to become one of the greatest philanthropists in history. He didn't just give away money. He applied his father's business principles to his giving, seeking systemic, large-scale solutions to societal problems. His cautious nature ensured that his philanthropic investments were deliberate, strategic, and breathtakingly effective. He funded the creation of entire fields of scientific research, built universities, and preserved national treasures like Williamsburg and the land for what would become Grand Teton National Park. The Great Depression, which ruined so many of his peers, only reinforced his lifelong habits. While others panicked, Rockefeller Jr. saw an opportunity to build, financing the colossal Rockefeller Center in New York City as a testament to his confidence in the American economy and a project that provided jobs for thousands. His story is the ultimate expression of a paradox. The relentless, almost painful frugality drilled into him as a boy did not stifle his generosity, but rather channeled it into a force of unprecedented social transformation. He was a billionaire's son who lived with the mind of a saver, proving that the most powerful fortunes are not those that are simply spent, but those that are meticulously, thoughtfully, and purposefully put to work. But if the Rockefellers represent wealth meticulously managed and purposefully stewarded across generations, the story of Robert Vesco is a descent into an entirely different kind of shadow. Here we find a man who did not inherit a fortune, but stole one, and then, in a bizarre twist of fate, found himself living a life of desperate poverty while the millions he had looted remained tantalizingly out of reach. Vesco's tale is not one of eccentric choice or philosophical discipline. It is a sordid chronicle of greed, flight, and the ultimate unraveling of a man who believed he could outsmart the entire world. In the early 1970s, Robert Vesco was a rising star in the high-flying world of international finance. He was the chairman of a company called Investors Overseas Services, or IOS, a massive mutual fund complex that managed billions of dollars for hundreds of thousands of small investors around the globe. With a charismatic demeanor and a reputation as a financial wizard, he cultivated an image of success, surrounded by the trappings of immense wealth, private jets, a luxurious yacht named the Distant Horizons, and a network of powerful political connections. But this glittering facade was a carefully constructed illusion. Behind the scenes, Vesco was systematically looting IOS, siphoning hundreds of millions of dollars from the company's coffers in one of the largest corporate frauds the world had ever seen. The scheme began to unravel in 1972. Facing scrutiny from the Securities and Exchange Commission in the United States, Vesco made a fateful and brazen decision. Rather than face justice, he fled the country, taking a fortune estimated at over $250 million with him. This act transformed him from a wealthy financier into an international fugitive, a man on the run with a price on his head and a trail of ruined investors behind him. His flight initiated a decades-long global game of cat and mouse as he hopscotched across the Caribbean and Latin America, using his stolen funds to bribe government officials and secure protection in countries with shaky extradition treaties. He found initial refuge in Costa Rica, where his lavish contributions to the ruling party bought him a brief period of sanctuary and even an appointment as a financial advisor. But the pressure from American authorities was relentless, and soon he was forced to move on, his immense wealth becoming both his weapon and his greatest liability, attracting as much trouble as it solved. It was in the early 1980s that Vesco's journey took its most dramatic turn, leading him to Fidel Castro's Cuba. At the time, Cuba was a pariah state, locked in a hostile standoff with the United States, and it seemed like the perfect final refuge for a man of Vesco's notoriety. He arrived with the promise of using his financial genius to help the communist regime circumvent the American economic embargo. The Cuban government, desperate for hard currency and economic innovation, initially welcomed him as a valuable asset. He was given a comfortable villa and a measure of security. But this alliance between a flamboyant capitalist crook and a hardened communist revolutionary was doomed from the start. The Cubans quickly grew suspicious of Vesco. They realized his schemes were often half-baked and fantastical, and they began to see him not as a savior, but as a political liability, a magnet for unwanted attention from their most powerful enemy. The relationship soured, and the Cuban government gradually tightened the screws, confiscating his passport, restricting his movements, and seizing control of what remained of his dwindling fortune. This is where the stark, almost unbelievable contrast of his life truly emerged. The man who had once commanded a fleet of luxury vehicles and a 228-foot yacht was now reduced to a threadbare existence in a dilapidated suburb of Havana. He lived with his wife and children in a small, run-down house with peeling paint, broken furniture, and a leaky roof. They struggled with constant power outages and a scarcity of basic food and clean water. The neighbors recalled seeing the former multimillionaire pedaling a battered bicycle through the streets, trying to barter for essentials like cooking oil and soap. The cash he had so masterfully stolen was now useless. The Cuban government held it, and he was trapped, living a life of profound deprivation that mirrored the very poverty experienced by many ordinary Cubans under the harsh economic conditions of this special period following the collapse of the Soviet Union. His wealth had become a phantom, a digital entry in a bank account he could no longer access, while his daily reality was one of grinding hardship. The final act of Vesco's life was as sordid as his crimes. No longer of any use to the Cuban regime and viewed as an ongoing embarrassment, he was arrested in 1995. The charges were not related to his financial crimes in the United States, but to a bizarre and reckless local scheme. The Cuban government accused him of fraud involving a supposed miracle drug to treat cancer and AIDS, a venture that epitomized his descent from high finance to desperate snake oil salesmanship. After a closed trial, he was convicted and sentenced to 13 years in a harsh Cuban prison. He spent his final years not in a penthouse, but in a cramped, squalid cell, his health deteriorating in the oppressive tropical heat. In 2007, at the age of 71, Robert Vesco died in prison, largely forgotten by the world. His body was reportedly claimed by his family, but the exact location of his grave remains unknown, a fittingly obscure end for a man who spent his last decades as a ghost. His stolen millions a curse that bought him nothing but a long, slow, and impoverished slide into oblivion. His story serves as a chilling counterpoint to the others we have explored, where they sought meaning or control through their relationship with poverty. Vesco found only the inevitable consequences of his own avarice, a stark lesson in how the pursuit of wealth without conscience can lead to the ultimate poverty of spirit and freedom. The man who had once navigated the world in a custom-built Boeing jet found himself navigating the potholed streets of a dilapidated Havana suburb on a rusty bicycle. This was the stark reality of Robert Vesco's existence in Cuba, a far cry from the polished decks of his yacht, the distant horizons. His initial welcome had been cautiously optimistic. The Cuban government, strangled by the American embargo, saw in Vesco a potential financial wizard who could help them unlock hidden streams of capital and engage in complex international arbitrage. He promised them the world, presenting himself as a master of the global financial system who could outmaneuver Washington's economic blockade. For a brief period, he was housed in a comfortable villa and treated as a valued, if peculiar, guest. But the alliance between a flamboyant, capitalist fugitive and Fidel Castro's austere communist regime was a fundamentally unstable compound, destined to explode. Vesco's schemes quickly revealed themselves to be more fantasy than finance. He proposed everything from setting up offshore banks to orchestrating massive commodities trades, but his ideas were often poorly conceived and utterly detached from the practical realities of doing business as a sanctioned state. The Cuban officials, who were ideologically opposed to the very system Vesco represented, grew increasingly skeptical. They began to realize the man they had harbored was not a financial savior, but a desperate charlatan, his once sharp mind now dulled by years on the run and the constant pressure of being a wanted man. The turning point came when the government, deciding he was more liability than asset, systematically stripped him of his power. They confiscated his passport, effectively making him a prisoner on the island. Then they froze and seized control of his remaining assets, leaving him with a fortune on paper, but not a dollar in his pocket. The hundreds of millions he had stolen were now a phantom lemon. He could remember the sensation of wealth, but it was utterly useless to him in his daily life. His living conditions deteriorated into a profound and soul-crushing poverty. He, his wife, and their children were moved to a small, decaying house in a neighborhood where power cuts were a daily occurrence and running water was a luxury. The paint peeled from the walls, the furniture was broken and sparse, and the tropical heat baked the uninsulated rooms. Neighbors would see the once dapper financier, now a gaunt and anxious figure, trying to barter for basic necessities like cooking oil, soap, or eggs. He became a fixture of the local black market, a shadow of his former self, constantly arguing over pennies. This was not the curated, self-imposed poverty of a Hetty Green. This was genuine, grinding destitution imposed upon him by circumstance. He was living the very life of scarcity that his entire criminal career had been an attempt to escape, a cruel and inescapable irony. As his financial schemes collapsed, Vesco's desperation reached a new, almost surreal low. In a final, pathetic attempt to prove his value to his captors, he pivoted from high finance to medical quackery. He began promoting a supposed miracle substance he called beryllium, a chemical compound he claimed could effectively treat, and even cure, both cancer and AIDS. This venture was a perfect metaphor for his entire decline, a fraudulent solution peddled by a fraudulent man. He managed to convince a few desperate individuals and even some low-level officials to invest in this snake oil. But the Cuban medical establishment, rightfully skeptical, saw it for what it was. This final, reckless fraud was the last straw for the Cuban government. He was no longer just an embarrassing guest. He was now an active con man operating within their borders, threatening to damage what little international credibility they had. In 1995, the curtain finally fell. Cuban authorities arrested Vesco, not for the centuries of charges awaiting him in the United States, but for his own pathetic beryllium fraud. His trial was swift and held behind closed doors, resulting in a 13-year prison sentence. The man who had stolen $250 million was convicted over a worthless fake medicine. His final years were spent not in a country club prison, but in a series of harsh, overcrowded Cuban penitentiaries. The conditions were brutal, stifling heat, inadequate food, and the constant threat of disease. The once powerful financier, who had dined with presidents and manipulated global markets, was now just another aging, sick inmate, forgotten by the world he had swindled. In 2007, at the age of 71, Robert Vesco died in custody. His body claimed by his family, but his final resting place unmarked and unknown. He died as he had lived his last 2 decades, penniless, powerless, and utterly alone. A chilling testament to the fact that the most devastating poverty is not always a lack of money, but the complete loss of freedom, dignity, and hope. From the self-imposed exile of Huguette Clark and the fugitive desperation of Robert Vesco, we now turn to a story that proves the most astonishing fortunes can sometimes be built from the absolute ground up. If the previous tales were about wealth being rejected or lost, the saga of Aristotle Onassis is the ultimate embodiment of rags to riches, a narrative where the rags were not a choice or a consequence, but the brutal, inescapable reality of his youth. Long before his name became synonymous with colossal supertankers, a legendary private island, and a marriage into America's most famous political dynasty, Aristotle Socrates Onassis was a penniless refugee, a young man whose entire world had been violently dismantled, forcing him to start his life over with nothing but a ferocious will to survive. His story begins not in a boardroom, but amidst the chaos and tragedy of war. Onassis was born in 1906 in Smyrna, a vibrant, cosmopolitan city on the coast of Anatolia, in what was then the Ottoman Empire. His family was prosperous, with a successful tobacco trading business, and for young Aristotle, life was comfortable and full of promise. But this world was utterly shattered in 1922 during the Greco-Turkish War. The Turkish army recaptured Smyrna, and the city was engulfed in a catastrophic fire and a horrific massacre targeting its Greek and Armenian populations. The Onassis family lost everything. His father was arrested and thrown into a brutal prison camp, and Aristotle himself was briefly detained and tortured. It was a baptism by fire, a sudden, brutal introduction to the darkest aspects of human nature and the absolute fragility of security. The family fortune was obliterated overnight. When they finally managed to escape, they were among the hundreds of thousands of Greek refugees flooding into Greece, arriving in Piraeus with little more than the clothes on their backs. This formative trauma of loss and displacement would become the central, driving force of his entire life, forging an ironclad determination to build a fortune so vast and so powerful that no war, no government, and no twist of fate could ever take it away from him. With few options in a destitute Greece, the ambitious young Onassis saw only one path forward: emigration. In 1923, at the age of 17, he boarded a ship bound for Argentina, clutching a passport from a country that, for all intents and purposes, no longer existed. He arrived in Buenos Aires with a grand total of $60 in his pocket and a head full of dreams that wildly outstripped his grim reality. His first home in the New World was a cramped, dingy boarding house room in the gritty La Boca neighborhood, an area known for its tango bars and its gritty, working-class immigrant population. To survive, he took whatever work he could find, laboring as a dishwasher, a construction worker, and a clerk. But his big break, the opportunity that would set him on his path, came from an invention that was still a novelty in many parts of the world: the telephone. He landed a job as a telephone operator for the British United River Plate Telephone Company, working the night shift. This was not a glamorous position. It was tedious, poorly paid work. Yet, for a young man with Onassis's preternatural cunning, the telephone exchange was not just a switchboard. It was a university. Sitting in that quiet office through the long night hours, Aristotle Onassis discovered his most valuable early asset: information. The Buenos Aires of the 1920s was a boomtown, a hub of international commerce, and its business community relied heavily on the telephone for urgent negotiations, especially with the time difference to Europe. Onassis, with his sharp mind and fluency in multiple languages, quickly realized he was perfectly positioned to eavesdrop on the most sensitive conversations of the city's merchants and commodities traders. He listened intently to deals being brokered for wheat, hides, and tobacco. He learned who was buying, who was selling, and what the real market prices were. He was getting a free, real-time education in international trade, and he began using this clandestine knowledge to make his first tiny forays into business. He would use his meager savings to make small, strategic investments, buying a commodity just before a major deal was announced and selling it for a quick, modest profit. It was a form of insider trading conducted from the shadows, a perfectly illegal but ruthlessly effective way for a young man with no connections to build a stake. He was no longer just a telephone operator. He was a ghost in the machine, using the tools of the modern world to pull himself out of the poverty they paid him to endure. This illicit nest egg gave him the capital, and more importantly, the confidence to step out from behind the switchboard. He quit his job and plunged into the business he knew best: the tobacco trade, the very same business his family had lost in Smyrna. He started his own import company, bringing in high-quality Turkish tobacco, a product he understood intimately and one that was in high demand among the thriving immigrant communities of Buenos Aires. But Onassis was not content to be a simple shopkeeper. He understood the power of perception. He invested every cent he had into crafting an image of success, buying a single, expensive suit and renting a small but prestigious office address, even if he couldn't always afford to heat it. He knew that in the world of high finance, appearances were a currency all their own. His relentless work ethic was legendary. He worked 16-hour days, personally overseeing every detail, from sales to logistics. His breakthrough came when he managed to secure a massive contract to supply tobacco to the entire Argentine army, a deal that catapulted his small operation into the big leagues. Within just a few years, the penniless refugee had become a millionaire. But for Aristotle Onassis, $1 million was only the beginning. He had learned the most valuable lesson of all in those early, impoverished years: that true wealth wasn't just about having money, but about possessing the unwavering audacity to seize it from a world that had once taken everything from him. Aristotle Onassis's first fortune, built on tobacco, was merely a stepping stone. He recognized that true, lasting power and wealth were not locked in the fragrant leaves of a crop, but in the movement of goods across the vast, open ocean. The global shipping industry, dominated by established European dynasties, became his new battlefield, and his weapon of choice was one that terrified most men: debt. With the capital from his thriving import business, he made his first foray into shipping, but not in the way one might expect. He didn't start small with a single, modest freighter. In a move that would define his entire career, he went straight for the throat, purchasing his first 6 ships at the absolute bottom of the market during the Great Depression. The world was awash in panic, and ship values had plummeted to historic lows. Old, established companies were desperate to unload their assets for pennies on the dollar. Where others saw only ruin, Onassis saw unprecedented opportunity. He understood that the global economy was cyclical and that depressions are inevitably followed by recoveries. He was betting everything on the comeback, using borrowed money to make that bet. His acquisition of those 6 Canadian freighters for a mere $20,000 each, a fraction of their pre-crash value, was a masterclass in leverage. He didn't pay for them outright with his tobacco earnings. Instead, he used that cash as a down payment, financing the rest through a Canadian bank. This was the core of his financial philosophy. Never use your own money when you can use someone else's. He saw debt not as a burden, but as a powerful tool for geometric expansion. By tying up a small amount of his own capital, he could control assets worth many times more. The risk, of course, was astronomical. If the shipping market didn't rebound, he would be crushed under the weight of loan payments for ships that were rotting in port, earning nothing. But Onassis, forged in the fires of Smyrna, had a risk tolerance that seemed superhuman to his contemporaries. The memory of losing everything overnight had immunized him against the fear of financial loss that paralyzed others. For him, the greater danger was inaction, the sin of missing a chance to build an empire when the world was handing him the bricks at a discount. His ambitions soon grew beyond just buying existing vessels. He dreamed of creating his own fleet from scratch, and to do that, he needed to conquer the most powerful shipbuilding nation on Earth, the United States. In a breathtakingly audacious move, he approached the formidable shipbuilding magnate, Henry J. Kaiser, with a plan to build new tankers. The audacity wasn't just in the scale of the order, but in its financing. Onassis proposed a deal that was virtually unheard of at the time. He would pay for the construction not with his own money, but with a loan from the U.S. government's Reconstruction Finance Corporation, guaranteed by the ships themselves as collateral. He was essentially asking America to fund a Greek national's expansion into an industry it dominated. Through a combination of relentless negotiation, sheer force of personality, and a brilliantly constructed business plan, he succeeded. This deal was more than just a financial coup. It was a declaration of a new world order in shipping. A refugee with a 6th grade education had just outmaneuvered the entire American establishment, using its own financial system to build his private navy. The end of World War II proved his Depression-era gamble to be one of the most lucrative in business history. The global economy roared back to life, and the demand for shipping, especially to transport oil, exploded. The ships he had acquired for a pittance were now worth fortunes, and the new tankers rolling out of American shipyards were like gold mills on the water. But Onassis wasn't content to simply ride the boom. He pioneered the long-term charter, a revolutionary business model that would become the bedrock of modern shipping. Instead of operating his tankers on the volatile spot market, he signed multi-year contracts with massive oil companies like Saucony Vacuum, the predecessor of Mobil. These contracts guaranteed a steady, predictable income stream, which in turn made his operations incredibly attractive to lenders. He could now walk into any bank in the world, show them a binding contract from a blue-chip oil giant, and secure massive loans to build even more ships. It was a self-perpetuating cycle of growth. More ships meant more charters, which meant more loans to build even more ships. He was building an empire on a foundation of other people's money and other people's guaranteed business, insulating himself from the very market fluctuations that had created his opportunity in the first place. This relentless drive for expansion was inextricably linked to the deep psychological scars of his youth. The poverty he endured as a refugee was not a memory he wished to forget. It was the fuel that powered his every waking moment. He wasn't just building a business. He was constructing a fortress, a personal universe so vast and so powerful that no government, no war, no twist of fate could ever tear it down again. His famous quote, "The secret of business is to know something that nobody else knows," was born from those nights at the telephone switchboard in Buenos Aires. He had learned that information was the ultimate currency, and he applied that lesson on a global scale, cultivating a network of spies and informants in ports and government offices around the world to always stay one step ahead. His appetite for luxury, the legendary yacht Christina O, his private island of Scorpios, his marriage to Jacqueline Kennedy, was not mere ostentation. It was a performative repudiation of his past. Every lavish party, every custom-built vessel, every headline-grabbing acquisition was a defiant shout to the world, and perhaps to himself, that the starving refugee from Smyrna was gone forever, replaced by a king whose domain was the seven seas. His life became the ultimate revenge against the poverty that had once defined him, a relentless, lifelong campaign to ensure that he would never, ever be poor again. While the lives of Hetty Green and Huguette Clark were marked by a retreat from their wealth, and Aristotle Onassis built his empire as a fortress against his impoverished past, the story of Charles Feeney presents a radical and almost revolutionary alternative. Here was a man who saw his colossal fortune not as a monument to himself, but as a temporary resource to be deployed with urgency and precision for the betterment of humanity. Known to the world for decades only as a successful businessman, Feeney was, in fact, a phantom, a secret philanthropist on a scale so vast it defied belief. As the co-founder of Duty Free Shoppers, he amassed a fortune that soared into the billions, yet his personal life was a study in stark, deliberate modesty. He flew exclusively in economy class, carried his papers in a plastic bag, owned neither a car nor a house, and famously wore a simple $10 Casio watch. This wasn't a performance of poverty born from anxiety like Hetty Green's, nor a retreat from the world like Huguette Clark's. For Charles Feeney, this frugality was the engine that would power one of the most astonishing acts of generosity in modern history, the quiet, systematic giving away of his entire fortune. The origins of this immense wealth lie in a brilliantly simple idea conceived in the post-war boom. In the 1950s, Feeney, a Cornell University graduate, partnered with a fellow alum, Robert Miller, to sell luxury goods like cigarettes and alcohol to American servicemen stationed in Asia and Europe, taking advantage of their tax-free status. This venture, Duty Free Shoppers, or DFS, tapped directly into the burgeoning era of global travel. They secured coveted concessions in international airports around the world, creating a retail empire that catered to a new, mobile class of consumers. The business was a gold mine, generating staggering profits as it expanded from Hong Kong to Hawaii, from Singapore to San Francisco. By the 1980s, Feeney's personal share of the enterprise was worth well over $1 billion, placing him firmly among the world's financial elite. Yet, unlike his peers, he felt no desire to build a public persona around this success. He avoided the limelight, shunned lavish parties, and continued to live with a simplicity that baffled those who knew the true scale of his wealth. This disconnect was the first clue to a secret he had been guarding for years. Unbeknownst to almost everyone, including his own business partners and children for a time, Feeney had already set in motion a plan to dismantle his own fortune. In 1982, he secretly transferred his entire stake in DFS, valued at hundreds of millions of dollars, to a new entity called the Philanthropies. He didn't just make large donations, he fundamentally gave away his ownership, the very source of his wealth. He and his wife signed the documents in a lawyer's office with no fanfare, no press release, and no desire for public accolades. From that moment on, the profits generated by his business would flow not into his pocket, but directly into a foundation with a mandate to give it all away. For years, he managed to keep this monumental transfer a secret, operating through a labyrinth of shell companies and intermediaries to conceal his identity as the donor behind massive grants to universities, hospitals, and human rights organizations. He became known in philanthropic circles simply as the anonymous American donor, a ghost who wrote checks for tens of millions of dollars while he himself rode the subway. The philosophy that drove this unprecedented act was what Feeney termed giving while living. He was deeply influenced by the words of Andrew Carnegie, who argued that the man who dies rich dies disgraced. But Feeney took this idea several steps further. He believed that waiting until death to distribute wealth through a will was a profound waste of potential. Money, he argued, could do more good today than it could decades from now. He saw the immense problems facing the world: poverty, disease, educational inequality, and human rights abuses, and believed that hoarding capital was an act of negligence. His mission became to strategically deploy his fortune within his own lifetime, to see the impact of his giving, to learn from it, and of course, correct in real time. He wasn't building an endowment to perpetuate his name. He was actively spending down the principal, aiming to bring the balance of Atlantic philanthropies to zero. This was philanthropy as a dynamic, urgent enterprise, not a static monument. He wanted his wealth to be a working tool, not a trophy locked in a vault. This commitment manifested in a personal austerity that was both pragmatic and philosophical. Every dollar he saved on a first-class ticket, on a luxury car, or on a 5-star hotel was another dollar that could be funneled into curing a disease or funding a scholarship. His $10 watch wasn't a quirky affectation. It was a symbol of a value system that prioritized utility over status. He famously said, "I have one pair of shoes." You can't wear 2 pairs of shoes at one time. This logic, so simple and direct, cut through the complex justifications for lavish consumption. He saw the trappings of extreme wealth as not just unnecessary, but as distractions from the real work of making a difference. This allowed him to operate with a unique freedom, without the burden of maintaining a public image or a lavish lifestyle. He could focus entirely on the efficacy of his giving. He and his small team at Atlantic Philanthropies became strategic investors in social change, conducting rigorous due diligence on potential grants, measuring outcomes, and focusing on leverage, funding projects that could catalyze broader systemic impact, such as the campaign for affordable health care in the United States or the peace process in Northern Ireland. The veil of secrecy finally lifted in 1997 when the sale of his remaining stake in DFS forced his identity into the open. The revelation sent shockwaves through the business and philanthropic world. Here was a billionaire who had been living like a middle-class retiree, while anonymously donating sums that rivaled the foundations of Carnegie and Rockefeller. The press dubbed him the James Bond of philanthropy, and his story became a global sensation. Yet, even in the glare of the spotlight, Feeney remained unchanged. He used the attention not to bask in praise, but to advocate for his giving while living philosophy, hoping to inspire other ultra-wealthy individuals to follow his example. His ultimate goal was reached in 2020, when Atlantic Philanthropies made its final grant and officially closed its doors. Over nearly 4 decades, Charles Feeney had given away more than $8 billion. He had achieved his mission, dying not financially rich, but rich in the profound satisfaction of having used his wealth as a powerful force for good. His life stands as a powerful counter-narrative, proving that the greatest use of a fortune may not be in its preservation or display, but in its complete and thoughtful dissolution for the benefit of others. Charles Feeney's dedication to a life of radical simplicity was the physical manifestation of his philosophy, a deliberate choice that amplified the impact of every dollar he gave away. While his secret foundation, Atlantic Philanthropies, was channeling hundreds of millions into transformative grants, Feeney himself resided in a modest, rented apartment in San Francisco. This wasn't a luxurious penthouse with panoramic views, but a simple, functional space in a building without any particular prestige. He didn't own a car, preferring to walk or use public transportation. And when he traveled the world to oversee his philanthropic projects, he always flew in the economy cabin. His most famous accessory was a plastic digital watch from Casio that cost about $10, a timepiece he wore for years, even as he was signing documents to transfer tens of millions to a university or a medical research institute. To an outside observer, he appeared to be a man of very modest means, a retiree living comfortably, but without any of the trappings of extreme wealth. This image was precisely the point. For Feeney, extravagant spending was not just a personal choice. It was a moral failure, a diversion of precious resources that could otherwise alleviate suffering or advance human knowledge. The inner workings of Atlantic Philanthropies were as meticulously austere as its founder's personal habits. Operating from a small, unassuming office, Feeney and his tight-knit team approached philanthropy with the disciplined focus of a venture capital firm, but with a radically different bottom line. Their goal was not to grow an endowment, but to strategically and systematically spend it down to zero. They conducted deep due diligence on every major grant, seeking what Feeney called leverage opportunities where their investment could catalyze much larger systemic change. A prime example is their monumental, long-term investment in higher education. Feeney, a proud graduate of Cornell University, gave his alma mater over $600 million, but almost all of it was given on the condition that it be used to fund specific, transformative projects, often requiring the university to match the funds, thereby doubling the impact. This wasn't about getting his name on a building. In fact, he insisted on anonymity for years and flatly refused any such dedications. The money was targeted to strengthen faculty, fund cutting-edge research, and provide scholarships, with the explicit aim of elevating the entire institution. He applied this same strategic approach globally, making historic gifts to universities in Ireland, Australia, and Vietnam, always with the same focus on measurable, long-term improvement rather than ceremonial recognition. This clandestine operation could not remain hidden forever. The necessity of a major business transaction finally tore away the curtain of secrecy in 1997, when the duty-free shoppers group was sold to the French luxury conglomerate LVMH. The legal and financial disclosures required to complete the deal inevitably revealed Feeney as the previously anonymous benefactor behind Atlantic Philanthropies. The revelation was a thunderclap in the worlds of business and philanthropy. The press scrambled to piece together the story of this mysterious billionaire who had been living like a middle-class accountant while directing one of the largest philanthropic foundations on the planet. He was featured on magazine covers and dubbed the James Bond of philanthropy for his decades of secret, high-stakes giving. Yet, even when thrust into the global spotlight, Feeney's demeanor and lifestyle did not change in the slightest. He used the newfound attention not for self-congratulation, but as a platform to passionately advocate for the principle he called giving while living. He argued that the traditional model of leaving wealth in a will was a wasted opportunity, that the urgent problems of today could not wait for the philanthropist's death. He believed that the donor, while still alive, could learn from their giving, adapt their strategies, and see the tangible fruits of their generosity, making the entire process more effective and personally fulfilling. His ultimate mission was reached in September of 2020, when Atlantic Philanthropies, having fulfilled its founding purpose, made its final grant and formally closed its doors. Over a span of 38 years, the foundation had given away a staggering $8.2 billion. Charles Feeney had achieved what he set out to do, successfully depleting his fortune for the benefit of others. He proved that a person could walk through the world without the armor of luxury, that true security comes not from the amount one possesses, but from the good one accomplishes. In a landscape often dominated by ego and ostentation, Feeney's life stands as a quiet but monumental testament to a different kind of power, the power of humility, the strength of conviction, and the profound impact of a billionaire who chose to live in poverty not out of fear or trauma, but out of a deep and abiding love for humanity. From the quiet, systematic generosity of Charles Feeney, we turn to a figure from an entirely different world, one defined by the roar of crowds and the crack of a rifle shot. In the glittering, often garish spectacle of the Gilded Age, where industrial fortunes were flaunted with breathtaking audacity, One woman carved out a unique path to wealth and fame, only to embrace a life of humble simplicity that stood in stark contrast to her public persona. Her name was Annie Oakley, and while her fortune may not have reached the billions of a Rockefeller, she was arguably one of the highest paid and most financially astute women of her era. As the star attraction of Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show, she commanded a staggering salary for the time, earning more than the Vice President of the United States. Yet, the woman who could effortlessly shatter glass balls mid-air with a .22 caliber rifle chose to live with a frugality and a charitable spirit that made her a different kind of sharpshooter, one who took precise aim at poverty and pretension with equal skill. Born Phoebe Ann Moses in 1860 in a rustic cabin in rural Ohio, poverty was not a philosophical concept for Annie. It was the blunt reality of her childhood. Her father died when she was just 6 years old, plunging the family into dire circumstances. She was sent to work at a county poor farm and later to a family who treated her with such cruelty that she referred to them as the wolves, forced into a form of indentured servitude. It was in this harsh environment that she first learned to hunt, using her late father's old rifle to put food on the table for her struggling mother and siblings. Every squirrel and rabbit she brought down meant the difference between a meal and going hungry. This early, brutal acquaintance with scarcity forged in her a deep and abiding respect for resources, a core value that would guide her financial decisions for the rest of her life. Money, for Annie, was never an abstraction. It was the tangible representation of security, a safeguard against the desperate hunger of her youth. Her incredible skill with a firearm became her ticket out of that poverty. After defeating professional marksman Frank Butler in a shooting contest, she not only launched her career, but also won a lifelong partner, as the two would later marry. When she joined Buffalo Bill's touring extravaganza, she became an international sensation. Audiences across America and Europe were captivated by her unparalleled precision, her quiet confidence, and her embodiment of the rugged American frontier spirit. She performed for royalty, including Queen Victoria, who reportedly pronounced her a very clever little girl. The financial rewards were immense. At her peak, she was earning around $1,000 a week, a sum that translates to well over $25,000 in today's money. Over a long career, this income built a fortune that could have easily funded a life of Gilded Age opulence, complete with mansions, carriages, and a wardrobe from the finest Parisian couturiers. Yet the lifestyle Annie and Frank Butler chose was one of remarkable modesty. They lived not in a sprawling estate, but in a comfortable yet unassuming home in Nutley, New Jersey, and later in a cottage in North Carolina. She was known for making her own clothes, often from practical, durable fabrics, and for being a meticulous manager of her household expenses. She avoided the lavish parties and ostentatious displays that consumed so many of her contemporaries. This was not the anxious hoarding of a Hetty Green, but a conscious and deeply held philosophy. Having known genuine need, she found no satisfaction in wasteful extravagance. Her wealth provided her with the freedom she valued most, the freedom from want, the freedom to control her own life, and the freedom to be generous. And generous she was, on a scale that remained largely hidden from the public eye. Annie Oakley's philanthropy was as precise and targeted as her shooting. She was a passionate advocate for the education and well-being of young women, quietly paying the college tuition for dozens of girls she read about in the newspapers or heard of through acquaintances, ensuring they had opportunities she herself had been denied. When a devastating hurricane flooded Galveston, Texas, in 1900, she traveled there at her own expense and performed benefit shows for weeks, donating every cent of the proceeds to the relief effort. Perhaps most remarkably, she offered to train and equip a regiment of 50 female sharpshooters to serve in the Spanish-American War, a proposal the War Department sadly declined. Her charity was active, personal, and direct, flowing from a profound sense of empathy born from her own hardscrabble beginnings. She understood that her fortune was not just for her security, but a tool to provide security for others. In this way, Annie Oakley represents a fascinating bridge between the worlds we have explored. She earned her wealth through her own guts and talent, much like Aristotle on Assus, but she wielded it with the strategic, life-affirming purpose of a Charles Feeney. She lived modestly by choice, not as a performance or a retreat, but as an authentic expression of her character. In the cacophonous theater of the Gilded Age, a period defined by its glaring inequalities and its worship of wealth, Annie Oakley stood as a quiet, steady counterpoint. She proved that one could scale the heights of fame and fortune without losing touch with the ground, demonstrating that true richness is found not in the abundance of possessions, but in the power to provide, to protect, and to empower others with the same fierce accuracy she displayed in the spotlight. The Winchester name echoed with the crack of rifle fire and the expansion of the American frontier. But for Sarah Winchester, the heiress to that colossal firearms fortune, the wealth felt less like a blessing and more like a spectral curse. Her story catapults us into a different dimension of our theme, where self-imposed poverty was not a quiet philosophical choice, but a frantic, decades-long construction project, a physical manifestation of a mind consumed by grief and terror. When Sarah inherited a staggering $20 million following the death of her husband, William Wirt Winchester, along with a nearly 50% ownership stake in the Winchester Repeating Arms Company, she became one of the wealthiest women in the world overnight. This fortune, which provided a continuous, massive income of about $1,000 every single day, should have guaranteed a life of unparalleled comfort and security. Instead, it funded a desperate, lifelong attempt to build her way out of spiritual damnation, resulting in a bizarre existence where she inhabited a tiny corner of a sprawling, chaotic mansion, a queen ruling over a kingdom of bewildering hallways and haunted rooms. The catalyst for this astonishing project was a profound and shattering series of losses. Sarah had already endured the death of her only child, her infant daughter Annie, a tragedy from which she never fully recovered. Then, just 15 years later, tuberculosis claimed her husband. These successive blows left her utterly bereft and psychologically adrift. According to a popular, though historically debated, account, she sought counsel from a Boston spiritualist medium in her despair. The medium delivered a chilling diagnosis. The Winchester family was haunted by the vengeful spirits of all the people killed by the gun that won the West, the Winchester rifle. The spirits, she was told, were responsible for her family's misfortunes, and they would not cease their torment until she atoned. The prescription was as specific as it was bizarre. she must move west to California and continuously build a house for these spirits. Stopping construction, the medium warned, would be a death sentence. As long as the hammers kept swinging, Sarah Winchester would continue to live. Driven by this potent mix of Victorian-era spiritualism and crushing grief, Sarah relocated to the Santa Clara Valley in 1886 and purchased an unfinished 8-room farmhouse. She immediately set to work, and for the next 38 years, until her death in 1922, construction on what would become the Winchester Mystery House never ceased. It was not architecture in any conventional sense. It was an exorcism in wood and plaster. The project had no master blueprint, no overarching plan. Instead, Sarah is said to have held nightly seances in her blue room, receiving building instructions directly from the spirits. Each morning, she would hand her carpenters hastily sketched designs for that day's work, leading to a structure that grew with a dreamlike, often nonsensical logic. The result was a labyrinthine monstrosity of 160 rooms, featuring stairs that lead directly into ceilings, doors that open onto 2-story drops to the ground below, and hallways that twist back on themselves in endless loops. It was a physical prison designed to confound the very ghosts she was trying to appease. A monument to fear built with the fortune generated by the instrument of that fear. Within this chaotic palace of 160 rooms, Sarah Winchester's personal existence was one of startling confinement and simplicity. While her fortune built ballrooms, soaring turrets, and opulent parlor rooms, she herself lived in a remarkably sparse set of quarters, reportedly occupying just a few small, interconnected rooms in the heart of the mansion. Her personal bedroom was simple, her belongings modest. She was a tiny, frail figure, often shrouded in a black veil, moving through the cavernous, echoing spaces of her own creation like a ghost herself. The mansion lacked any central heating, and many of the hundreds of fireplaces were purely decorative, making the vast building cold and drafty. She would move from one section to another, seemingly to avoid the spirits she believed were congregating in certain areas, her life a constant game of hide and seek with an invisible enemy. The immense wealth flowing in from the east was immediately converted into building materials, and the wages for the large crew of carpenters who worked 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. She spent an estimated $5.5 million on this endless construction, a sum equivalent to well over $150 million today, yet her personal life was devoid of the lavish parties, fine art collections, or luxurious travel that defined other Gilded Age heiresses. Her poverty was not one of finances, but of peace, and her wealth was the engine of her own perpetual torment. The architectural oddities of the house seemed to perfectly mirror the labyrinth of her troubled mind. The obsession with the number 13 is found everywhere: 13 bathrooms, 13 windows in a room, 13 panels in a ceiling, 13 steps on many staircases. There are closets that open into blank walls, cupboards barely an inch deep, and a notorious switchback staircase that makes 7 complete turns while ascending only about 9 feet, supposedly built to flummox any pursuing spirits. One of the most poignant features is the door to nowhere on the 2nd floor, which opens into empty air, a stark metaphor for her own life's trajectory, a journey that began with promise and led to a sheer, terrifying drop. Every bizarre detail can be interpreted as a defensive measure or an act of obedience to her otherworldly instructions. The house was not a home, it was a desperate, physical prayer, a colossal ritual object built to protect its creator from a curse she believed was financed by her own bank account. Historians have offered alternative, more psychological interpretations of Sarah Winchester's actions, suggesting that the story of the Boston medium may be more legend than fact. They propose that her endless building was simply a consuming, albeit eccentric, hobby for an immensely wealthy, intelligent, and profoundly bored widow. As a woman in the late 19th century, she had few avenues for her energy and intellect. Architecture and construction became her passion and her purpose, a way to exert control over a world that had taken so much from her. In this reading, the mansion is not a haunted prison, but a testament to a creative, if unorthodox, mind, a woman experimenting with architectural forms without the constraints of a male architect or a conventional purpose. Yet, even this more sympathetic view cannot erase the palpable aura of sadness and isolation that clings to the story. Whether driven by spiritual terror or a search for meaning, her life became a profound paradox. She used one of America's great industrial fortunes to construct a monument not to power or beauty, but to anxiety and escape, living a life of spiritual and emotional poverty inside a physical shell of bewildering, extravagant excess. The Winchester Mystery House stands today as a haunting tourist attraction, its true story forever blurred by myth, leaving us with an enduring image of a woman so haunted by the source of her wealth that she spent a lifetime and a fortune trying to build walls high enough to keep the ghosts out. The psychological torment that fueled the endless construction of the Winchester Mystery House reveals a woman trapped not just by her grief, but by the very nature of her fortune. While the story of the Boston spiritualist is dramatic, the true roots of Sarah Winchester's anguish likely ran even deeper, intertwining the era's fascination with the afterlife with a devastating personal guilt. The Victorian age was obsessed with death and spiritualism, a cultural backdrop that would have made the medium's warning terrifyingly plausible to a woman who had lost her entire family. But beyond general societal beliefs, Sarah may have been grappling with a more specific, corrosive form of remorse. The immense wealth that provided her with the means to build came directly from the Winchester rifle, a weapon that had indeed reshaped the nation through unprecedented violence on the frontier and in countless conflicts. It is not difficult to imagine a sensitive, intelligent woman like Sarah internalizing a sense of responsibility, viewing her personal tragedies as a divine punishment for the bloodshed that funded her luxurious life. This potential guilt transformed her inheritance from a blessing into a spiritual burden, a poisoned chalice she felt compelled to atone for through ceaseless, exhausting labor. This profound internal conflict manifested in the architecture itself, turning the mansion into a sprawling, three-dimensional diary of a troubled mind. The infamous stairs that lead directly into ceilings and doors that open to blank walls or sudden drops are more than just curiosities. They are the physical embodiment of confusion and hopelessness. The labyrinthine hallways that double back on themselves mimic the tortuous paths of a conscience, seeking an exit from remorse, but finding only dead ends. Her reported obsession with the number 13, woven throughout the house in everything from bathroom counts to ceiling panels, points to a mind consumed by superstition and the need for ritualistic protection. The most poignant feature, the door to nowhere, serves as a powerful metaphor for her own existence after the deaths of her husband and child, a life that had lost its direction and purpose, opening into a void of loss and fear. The house was not designed for human comfort or social enjoyment. It was engineered as a defensive fortress against spectral vengeance, a desperate attempt to use the fortune she saw as tainted to build a barrier against the consequences of that same wealth. Within this chaotic palace of 160 rooms, Sarah Winchester's personal existence was a study in stark contrast and profound isolation. While her fortune built grand ballrooms and opulent receiving parlors, she herself lived like a ghost in her own home, occupying only a few sparse, interconnected rooms. She was often described as a tiny, frail figure shrouded in a black veil, moving silently through the cavernous, echoing hallways. The mansion, for all its size, lacked many basic comforts. It had no central heating, and many of its numerous fireplaces were purely decorative, leaving the vast spaces cold and drafty. She would reportedly move her sleeping quarters from one section of the house to another, guided by seance instructions or her own paranoia, in a constant game of hide and seek with the unseen spirits she believed were her tormentors. Her days were spent in a reclusive routine, overseeing the endless construction, sketching out new plans, and attending to her few personal interests, all while surrounded by the relentless sound of hammers and saws, the very noise that, according to her beliefs, was keeping her alive. This reclusive life, funded by a continuous river of cash, represents a different kind of poverty altogether. Sarah Winchester suffered from a poverty of peace, a scarcity of joy, and a profound emotional isolation. Her wealth allowed her to withdraw completely from the world, but it could not buy her companionship, comfort, or a moment's quiet from the voices in her head. She had the financial means to acquire anything she desired, yet she chose to live with remarkable personal frugality inside her chaotic castle, her needs simple, her existence monastic. The millions spent on construction were not an indulgence but a toll, a ransom paid to the spirits for her continued survival. Her story becomes a devastating paradox. She was one of the wealthiest women in the world, yet she lived in a state of constant psychological want, her immense resources serving only to amplify her fear and cement her loneliness. The Winchester Mystery House stands not just as a tourist attraction, but as a permanent monument to the idea that the most devastating poverty is not always financial, but can be a deep and unending famine of the spirit. The narrative of wealth and its precarious nature takes another dramatic turn when we cross the Irish Sea to meet a man whose story is a stark, modern parable about the speed at which a towering empire can crumble. Sean Quinn was not just wealthy. He was, for a time, the richest person in all of Ireland, a title that carried immense weight in a country experiencing the dizzying highs of the Celtic Tiger economic boom. His journey began not with an inheritance, but with a single, far-sighted loan of £100 in 1973. He used this tiny stake to open a small gravel quarry on his family's farm in County Fermanagh, a humble operation that would become the foundation stone of a sprawling, multi-billion-dollar conglomerate. Quinn's genius lay in his almost intuitive understanding of basic industries. He expanded from gravel into cement, then into precast concrete products, strategically positioning himself to supply the very materials that were building a new, prosperous Ireland. As the country's economy skyrocketed, so did his fortune, with the Quinn Group expanding into glass, plastics, and hotels, becoming one of the nation's largest private employers and a powerful symbol of homegrown success. His personal life reflected this meteoric rise. The Quinn family lived in a manner befitting their status, with a magnificent mansion, a fleet of luxury cars, and a level of local influence that was almost feudal. He was celebrated as a folk hero, a self-made man who had pulled himself up by his bootstraps and brought prosperity to a rural region that had often been left behind. His employees were fiercely loyal, and his name was synonymous with shrewd business acumen and unwavering confidence. This confidence, however, would eventually curdle into a fatal hubris. At the very peak of his success, sitting atop an empire valued in the billions, Sean Quinn made a decision that would unravel everything he had spent a lifetime building. He decided to gamble not on the solid industries he understood so well, but on the volatile, high-stakes casino of the stock market, placing an enormous bet on the soaring shares of one particular bank, Anglo-Irish. Anglo-Irish Bank was the glittering, high-flying emblem of Ireland's economic miracle. It was the lender to the country's new elite, the developers and entrepreneurs who were reshaping the urban landscape with ambitious, debt-fueled projects. Its share price was climbing to unprecedented heights, and Quinn, like many others, saw it as a sure thing. Using a dangerously complex financial instrument known as contracts for difference, or CFDs, he began to secretly build a massive stake in the bank. CFDs are a form of leveraged bet. They allow an investor to speculate on a company's share price without actually owning the shares, magnifying both potential gains and catastrophic losses. It was a way to make a huge wager with a relatively small initial outlay, but it left the bettor terrifyingly exposed if the market moved against them. At his peak, Sean Quinn had built a CFD position that represented a staggering 25% of the entire bank. A bet so large that it effectively meant his fate was now inextricably tied to the health of a single, hyper-aggressive financial institution. When the global financial crisis hit in 2008, it didn't just cause a recession. It exposed a house of cards built on reckless lending and speculative euphoria. Anglo-Irish Bank, as the most exposed lender to the collapsing property market, was the epicenter of the Irish economic earthquake. Its share price didn't just dip. It went into a total freefall, plummeting from over 17 euros to mere pennies in a matter of months. For Sean Quinn, this wasn't just a market downturn. It was a financial execution. The contracts for difference he had used to build his position now demanded he pay enormous margin calls, huge sums of cash to cover his mounting losses. As the price kept falling, the demands for cash became insatiable. He was forced to liquidate other assets, but it was like trying to bail out a sinking ocean liner with a bucket. The losses quickly spiraled into the billions, completely wiping out his personal fortune and sinking the profitable Quinn Group into a quagmire of debt it could not escape. The fall was as swift as it was brutal. The once celebrated billionaire was now the nation's most famous bankrupt. In a stunning reversal of fortune, the Irish government, which had taken control of the ruined Anglo-Irish bank, pursued Quinn relentlessly for the 2.8 billion euros he owed. His family's assets were seized: the mansion, the properties, the valuable businesses he had built from the ground up. He was declared bankrupt, and in a series of devastating court battles, he was even sentenced to prison for 9 months for contempt of court after a judge found he had hidden assets from the bank in a complex international web. The man who had been a symbol of Irish success was now a symbol of its spectacular crash. His name, a byword for catastrophic financial folly. He went from overseeing a global empire to reporting to a government-appointed official, his financial life entirely controlled by others. Today, Sean Quinn lives a life that is a shadow of his former existence. He resides in a modest, rented bungalow near his original family farm, a stone's throw from the sprawling industrial complex that once bore his name but is now under the control of others. He is no longer the master of his destiny, but a pensioner dependent on the state. A dramatic and humbling come down for a man who once commanded such immense power and wealth. His story is a chillingly modern cautionary tale about the dangers of over-leverage and the illusion of invincibility that great wealth can create. Unlike Huguette Clark's quiet retreat or Charles Feeney's purposeful giving, Quinn's poverty was thrust upon him by a combination of a global crisis and a single, monumental miscalculation. It demonstrates with brutal clarity that in our interconnected world, fortunes built over decades can be obliterated in a matter of months, leaving behind not just financial ruin, but a legacy forever defined by the gamble that was lost. The collapse of Sean Quinn's empire was not merely a financial event. It was a national drama that unfolded in courtrooms and on the front pages of every newspaper in Ireland. After the catastrophic CFD losses obliterated his fortune, the Irish government, now the effective owner of the failed Anglo-Irish Bank through its National Asset Management Agency, pursued him with a relentless determination to recover the staggering 2.8 billion euros he owed. This was not a negotiation, it was a financial siege. One by one, the assets that constituted his life's work were stripped away. The profitable Quinn Group, with its thousands of employees, was placed into administration, its control wrenched from the Quinn family and handed over to a state-appointed receiver. The family's magnificent mansion, their extensive property portfolio, their luxury cars, and even their personal bank accounts were seized. In a bitter and public humiliation, the man who had been celebrated as a king in his own county was declared a bankrupt, his financial autonomy completely extinguished. This legal war quickly expanded to engulf his entire family, turning private strife into a very public spectacle. His wife and 5 children found themselves entangled in a complex web of litigation, accused of conspiring to put valuable international property assets beyond the reach of the state. The courts heard allegations of a sophisticated scheme involving companies registered in places like Cyprus and Russia, designed to shield hundreds of millions of euros from the bank's receivers. In a series of dramatic rulings, several of Quinn's children and his son-in-law were found in contempt of court for their roles in this asset-stripping operation and were sentenced to prison. The image was devastating. The once united Quinn family, a symbol of self-made success, was now portrayed in the media as a criminal enterprise, its members facing the stark reality of a jail cell. For Sean Quinn himself, the legal consequences culminated in a 9-month prison sentence for contempt, a period that marked the absolute nadir of his fall from grace. The billionaire industrialist was now an inmate, a transformation that served as the ultimate symbol of how thoroughly his world had been inverted. What makes Quinn's story so compelling and so tragic is his own public portrayal of his new reality. Unlike the reclusive Huguette Clark or the secretive Charles Feeney, Quinn has been vocal about his downfall, granting interviews where he speaks with raw emotion about the hardship of his new life. He now lives in a modest, rented bungalow overlooking Darylin, the very community where he built his first quarry. From his window, he can see the sprawling manufacturing plants that still bear his name but are no longer his to command. He has described the profound psychological toll of this reversal, the feeling of being a spectator to his own legacy. He is a state pensioner, his income a tiny fraction of what his businesses once generated in a single minute. The man who once made decisions affecting thousands now reports to a government official regarding his personal finances. In one particularly poignant interview, he lamented the loss of simple freedoms, stating that he could no longer even afford to buy a round of drinks for friends at the local pub, a deeply symbolic loss of status and generosity in Irish culture. His narrative is one of a man who believes he was unfairly targeted, a view that resonates with a segment of the Irish public who see him as a homegrown hero brought down by the very financial institutions that crippled the country. He has consistently argued that while his gamble on Anglo-Irish Bank was a catastrophic error, the bank itself engaged in predatory behavior, encouraging his massive CFD position even as its own foundations were crumbling. This perspective casts his story not just as one of personal failure, but as a symptom of a wider systemic corruption, where the high-flying bankers who fueled the bubble escaped largely unscathed, while the industrialists who built tangible businesses were crushed. This duality makes him a deeply controversial figure, simultaneously a cautionary tale about the perils of hubris and a sympathetic emblem of a nation's betrayed economic promise. The Quinn saga thus stands as a distinctly modern cautionary tale, one uniquely suited to our era of volatile global finance. It demonstrates that billionaire status is not a permanent citadel, but can be a house of cards, vulnerable to a single, poorly understood financial instrument and a sudden shift in the economic wind. His fall was not a slow decline, but a precipitous crash, unfolding over months rather than decades. It underscores a terrifying truth of the 21st century. Leverage can create empires at breathtaking speed, but it can also demolish them with even greater force, leaving behind not just empty bank accounts, but a shattered family name and a legacy forever defined by its spectacular final chapter. In the end, Sean Quinn's life embodies a painful paradox, a reminder that the same ambition and risk-taking that build a fortune from nothing can also be the very forces that ultimately destroy it. Yet another tale of princely poverty emerges not from the cutthroat world of high finance, but from the quiet, cobwebbed corridors of a vanished German monarchy. To understand the peculiar saga of Prince Heinrich the 24th of Reuss, we must first step into the intricate and peculiar world of the German principalities that existed before the Great War. The House of Reuss was a minor but ancient noble family, ruling over two tiny, landlocked states in what is now Thuringia. Their domains were small, but their pride was immense, and they were known for one of the most bewildering naming traditions in all of European aristocracy. For centuries, every single male in the senior line was named Heinrich or Henry, in honor of a revered 12th century emperor. To tell them apart, they were numbered, but the system reset with each new century. So, a prince born in 1880 would be Heinrich the 20th, while his son born in 1905 would be Heinrich the 21st. It was a world of rigid protocol and ancient custom, a world that Prince Heinrich the 24th was born into in the late 19th century, and a world that would utterly collapse beneath his feet. His early life was one of predictable privilege, groomed for a role of quiet leadership within his small domain. He stood to inherit not a vast kingdom, but a respectable fortune tied to ancestral forests, farmlands, and the family castle. The Reuss estates, while not on the scale of a Rockefeller or an Onassis, provided a comfortable, guaranteed income that ensured a life of ease and social standing for their princes. Yet, the turning point for Heinrich came not with a market crash or a bad investment, but with a bitter and protracted legal dispute within his own family. The details are complex, rooted in the arcane inheritance laws of the German nobility, but the outcome was devastatingly simple. Heinrich found himself essentially disinherited from the bulk of the family's wealth. The estates and the income were allocated to other branches, leaving him with a glorious title, an impeccable pedigree, and a shockingly small bank account. He was a prince in name, but his financial foundation had been pulled out from under him, a precarious position that would soon become catastrophic. Then came the deluge of 1918. The end of World War I brought not just defeat for Germany, but a revolutionary wave that swept away its entire imperial structure. The Kaiser abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. In all of the countries, 24 monarchies from mighty kingdoms like Bavaria and Prussia to tiny principalities like Reuss were abolished overnight. The Weimar Republic was declared, and with a stroke of a pen, Prince Heinrich the 24th lost the last vestiges of his worldly power. His title became a mere courtesy, a social formality with no legal standing. The state seized what remained of the formerly princely properties, and a new law specifically targeted the assets of the ruling houses, redistributing their wealth. For a prince like Heinrich, who was already financially weakened by the family feud, this was the final crushing blow. The safety net of his birthright was gone, and he was left to free fall into a new, harsh reality. What followed was a scene of almost Shakespearean pathos. The prince, who had been raised in castles and educated for a life of leadership, was reduced to living in a small, simple gardener's cottage on the outskirts of his former domain. This was not a charming country retreat. It was a genuine dwelling of necessity, a stark contrast to the grandeur he had known. Photographs from the time show a gaunt, elderly man with a kind but weary face, often dressed in worn, patched clothing that was a far cry from the uniforms and formal wear of his youth. His new home was sparsely furnished, heated by a simple stove, and devoid of the artworks and servants that had once defined his existence. He became a familiar, somewhat tragic figure in the local village, a living monument to a world that had disappeared. The neighbors would see him tending a small vegetable garden, trying to grow his own food, or taking long, solitary walks through the forests that he once owned. He was now a pensioner of the very state that had dismantled his inheritance, living on a meager stipend that was a cruel mockery of his birthright. The profound irony of his situation was not lost on anyone. Here was a man who could trace his lineage back through centuries of European history, who held a title that commanded respect in the Almanach de Gotha, the directory of European nobility, yet he could barely afford to keep the roof over his head repaired. He was a pauper prince, a walking contradiction who highlighted the absurdity of clinging to ancient hierarchies in a modern, democratic world. His poverty was not chosen, like Charles Feeney's, nor was it a psychological prison, like Sarah Winchester's. It was imposed upon him by the twin hammers of personal misfortune and historical inevitability. He became a symbol of the countless minor nobles across Europe, whose lives were utterly upended by the political earthquakes of the early 20th century, their wealth and status evaporating as empires fell. For Prince Heinrich, his title was no longer a badge of honor, but a constant, painful reminder of everything he had lost, a name that echoed with the ghosts of castles in a way of life that was gone forever. The daily existence of Prince Heinrich the 24th was a quiet, unending lesson in the art of making do. His mornings began not with a valet laying out fine clothes, but with the simple, personal task of dressing in garments that had been meticulously mended and cared for over many years. His home, the former gardener's cottage, was a world away from the ancestral castles of his lineage. It was a small, sparsely furnished dwelling, its rooms heated by a single, modest stove that required his own attention to keep the chill of the German winters at bay. He would often be seen tending a small vegetable patch behind the cottage, his hands, once accustomed to holding ceremonial scepters, now dirty from the soil as he worked to supplement his meager food supply. His walks through the surrounding Thuringian forest were no longer the leisurely inspections of a landowner, but the necessary excursions of a man seeking solace, and perhaps a few foraged mushrooms to add to his humble table. The local villagers knew him as a kind, solitary figure, a man who carried himself with an innate dignity that his worn-out jacket and patched trousers could not conceal. They understood his situation, a peculiar blend of respect and pity coloring their interactions with this living relic of a bygone era. He was a part of their community, yet forever set apart by the weight of a title that had become an empty shell. This stark existence was underpinned by a financial reality that was both humiliating and inescapable. Following the abolition of the German monarchies, the new Weimar Republic had enacted a series of laws aimed at dismantling the economic power of the aristocracy. While some of the very wealthiest families, like the Hohenzollerns, managed to retain significant private fortunes through complex legal maneuvers, the lesser nobility, like the Russes, were utterly devastated. Their former state-owned properties and assets were seized by the government. In an attempt to prevent total destitution for the former ruling houses, the state provided a small, fixed pension. But for a man like Heinrich, who had already been financially weakened by the family dispute, this stipend was a pittance. It was just enough for basic survival, a cruel parody of the civil list payments that had once funded his family's court. He was, in effect, a pensioner of the very republic that had rendered his title obsolete, his survival dependent on the goodwill of the system that had dismantled his world. The irony was profound and inescapable. The name he carried, which in a previous century would have opened every door and commanded instant obedience, now held no power beyond a memory, and it certainly could not pay for a new pair of shoes or a proper meal. Heinrich's story was far from unique. Across the fractured landscape of post-war Germany and the dissolved Austro-Hungarian Empire, thousands of minor aristocrats found themselves in the same heartbreaking position. They were counts and barons who now worked as traveling salesmen or hotel clerks, princesses who were forced to become governesses or seamstresses to support their families. This phenomenon became known as genteel poverty, a specific form of hardship defined by the preservation of social manners and a proud bearing in the face of crushing financial need. These individuals clung to the outward forms of their upbringing, the precise way of speaking, the formal manners, the knowledge of etiquette and genealogy, even as they lived in cramped apartments and worried about the cost of heating oil. Their pride became both their shield and their prison. They would rather starve quietly than admit their need to the new industrialists and commoners, who were now the true masters of society. For Prince Heinrich, this meant accepting his fate with a quiet stoicism. There were no loud complaints, no public pleas for help. His dignity was the last vestige of his inheritance, and he guarded it as jealously as his ancestors had guarded their castles. The psychological toll of this fall from grace is difficult to overstate. To be raised from birth with the certain knowledge of your own superiority and destiny to lead, only to have that entire identity invalidated by a political revolution, was a form of trauma that reverberated through this entire generation of nobles. Every day was a reminder of loss. A walk through the forest was a journey through a landscape he once owned. A glimpse of the family castle, now perhaps a museum or a government building, was a stab of nostalgia for a home that was no longer his. The title Prince was no longer a description of power, but a label for a curated museum piece, a living exhibit of a world that had been swept into the dustbin of history. For Heinrich, his life became a performance of a role that had lost its script. He played the part of the prince with innate grace, but the stage had shrunk to a small cottage, and the audience was a village that viewed him with a mixture of curiosity and sympathy. His poverty was not just a lack of money. It was an existential condition, a life lived in the long, fading shadow of vanished grandeur, where the richest possession he had left was a memory of what once was. From the quiet desperation of a German prince to the sun-scorched deserts of Las Vegas, our exploration of wealth and self-imposed poverty takes its most dramatic and psychologically complex turn with the final, haunting chapter in the life of Howard Hughes. If the previous stories were about the fear of loss, the burden of inheritance, or the collapse of an empire, Hughes's story is a chilling descent into a different kind of abyss, one forged by a mind turning in on itself, where unimaginable wealth became the tool for building a perfect, sterile prison. In his prime, Hughes was the embodiment of the American dream, a dashing aviator, a visionary film producer, and a ruthless industrialist whose fortunes stretched into the billions. He broke world airspeed records, produced Hollywood classics like Hell's Angels, built Hughes aircraft into a defense giant, and once owned Trans World Airlines. He was a celebrity who dated Katharine Hepburn and Ginger Rogers, a man who moved through the world with audacious confidence and style. Yet, the same formidable intellect that orchestrated these triumphs would ultimately wage a war against invisible enemies, leading him to an existence of shocking squalor, a hermit sealed away from the very world he had once seemed to master. The transformation was gradual, accelerated by a near-fatal air crash in 1946. While piloting the experimental XF-11 reconnaissance plane, Hughes lost control and crashed into a Beverly Hills neighborhood, suffering catastrophic injuries including crushed ribs, a collapsed lung, and severe burns. The physical pain was immense, but the psychological impact was even more profound. To manage his agony, his doctors prescribed significant amounts of morphine and codeine, sparking a lifelong and debilitating addiction to opiates. This event seemed to act as a catalyst, intensifying pre-existing eccentricities into full-blown, debilitating compulsions. The meticulousness that had served him so well in engineering and business mutated into a paralyzing, obsessive-compulsive disorder. His focus shifted from conquering the skies to controlling an invisible microbial world he believed was plotting his destruction. What began as a reasonable concern for hygiene in an era before antibiotics spiraled into a pathological germophobia that would dictate every aspect of his remaining life. This escalating fear precipitated his great withdrawal from public life. By the late 1950s, the dashing public figure had virtually vanished. He began a nomadic existence, moving between secluded bungalows in Beverly Hills, a remote ranch in British Columbia, and finally, a self-imposed exile in a series of Las Vegas hotel suites that would become the sealed inner sanctums of his madness. His final and most famous prison was the 9th-floor penthouse of the Desert Inn on the Las Vegas Strip. He did not choose this suite for its view of the glittering city below. In fact, the windows were permanently sealed with blackout curtains, duct tape, and aluminum foil to block out all sunlight and dust. The air was filtered through a complex system of hospital-grade HEPA filters, and the rooms were kept in a state of pressurized sterility, creating an environment he believed was safe from contaminants. The temperature was maintained at a precise and constant level, a climate-controlled bubble in the heart of the Nevada desert. Within this sterile vault, however, the reality of his daily life was anything but clean. The man who commanded boardrooms and movie sets now existed in a state of profound physical neglect that defied belief. Hughes spent his final years largely naked, sitting in a worn-out recliner chair that he designated his germ-free zone. He would remain immobile for days, even weeks on end, urinating into bottles and storing his bodily waste in glass jars, which he would carefully label and stack around the room. His legendary long hair, once impeccably groomed, became a matted, greasy tangle that fell down his back. His beard grew wild and unkempt, but most shocking of all were his fingernails and toenails, which he refused to allow anyone to cut. They grew into grotesque, yellowed talons, curling and twisting like corkscrews, some measuring several inches in length. His emaciated body, ravaged by drug abuse and malnutrition, was covered in bed sores. This was the paradoxical heart of his condition, a man so terrified of microscopic germs that he lived in a macroscopic state of filth and decay, a living contradiction of immense power and profound helplessness. His daily routines were elaborate rituals designed to appease his obsessions, governed by a strict and incomprehensible code of conduct that his small, rotating staff of Mormon aides, known as the Mormon Mafia, were forced to follow. Any interaction with the outside world was mediated through layers of insulation. To hand him a simple object, like a spoon or a magazine, an aide had to first cover his own hand with a stack of clean paper towels. Hughes himself would use wads of tissues to handle anything, creating a protective barrier between his skin and the contaminated world. His diet was severely restricted and bizarre, often consisting of only one type of food for months at a time, sometimes just chicken soup, or only vanilla ice cream and canned peas. The preparation of these meals was a source of immense anxiety. He once became obsessed with the size of the peas, insisting they be sorted by size with a special tool before he would eat them. And he issued a detailed memorandum to his staff on the exact procedure for opening a can of fruit to prevent any dust from the can's lid from falling into the contents. These rituals were not the habits of an eccentric. They were the desperate coping mechanisms of a mind trapped in a labyrinth of its own making, where every action was a potential life or death scenario. The tragedy of Howard Hughes is that his wealth did not save him. It enabled his demise. His fortune provided the resources to construct this hermetic prison and to pay the aides who facilitated his isolation. He could afford to buy entire hotels, as he did with the Desert Inn, simply to avoid being evicted from his suite. He could command a private fleet of jets to move his entire sterile environment from one location to another. His money insulated him from the interventions that might have saved a less wealthy person. There was no family member or doctor who could force him into treatment, as he was the ultimate authority in his own sealed universe. His aides, loyal and well compensated, became unwitting accomplices in his self-destruction, following his increasingly irrational orders out of a mixture of fear, duty, and the substantial paychecks he provided. His wealth became the very barrier that separated him from the help he so desperately needed, proving that financial resources can sometimes build the walls of a prison rather than the gates to freedom. In his final months, his physical and mental state deteriorated beyond recognition. He weighed less than 90 pounds, his body a skeleton draped in skin, his system ravaged by chronic kidney disease and years of drug abuse. His world had shrunk to the dimensions of a single bed in a private jet, flying between his penthouse in Acapulco and a hospital in Houston. He was so frail and unrecognizable that when he died on April 5th, 1976, the FBI had to use his fingerprints to formally identify the body. The public revelation of his condition sent shockwaves around the world. The brilliant, dashing billionaire had been reduced to a reclusive specter, a cautionary tale about the corrosive power of untreated mental illness, even when cushioned by all the money in the world. His story forces us to confront a difficult truth, that the most devastating poverty is not always about a lack of material possessions, but can be a profound deprivation of human connection, mental peace, and the simple, unmediated experience of being alive. Howard Hughes did not choose poverty in the financial sense, but he ultimately inhabited a world of existential scarcity, a stark reminder that no fortune, no matter how vast, can purchase immunity from the demons within. The final years of Howard Hughes were not merely a period of seclusion, but a chilling, slow motion unraveling of a human psyche. A spectacle made possible only by the immense fortune that insulated him from any form of intervention. His world shrank to a series of sealed hotel suites, first at the Desert Inn in Las Vegas, and later in locations from Nicaragua to the Bahamas, each one meticulously transformed into a sterile, sensory deprivation tank. The windows were permanently sealed with blackout curtains, heavy-duty tape, and layers of aluminum foil, blocking out not just the Nevada sun, but the very concept of day and night. The air was his obsession. He had complex, hospital-grade air filters installed, creating a constant, low hum of purified airflow. And he demanded that positive air pressure be maintained to prevent any outside contaminants from seeping into his sanctum. The temperature was maintained at a precise and constant level, often an uncomfortably cool 68 degrees Fahrenheit, creating a climate-controlled bubble that existed in stark opposition to the vibrant, chaotic life of the Las Vegas Strip just beyond his walls. Within this multimillion-dollar fortress, however, the reality was one of profound and shocking squalor. Hughes's physical deterioration was a direct consequence of his mental anguish. He spent months and then years confined to a single worn-out recliner chair that he had designated his official, germ-free zone. He would often remain motionless for days on end, staring at the same movies played on a continuous loop, his only companions the flickering images on the screen. His legendary personal hygiene, once that of a Hollywood leading man, completely disintegrated. He frequently went naked, his emaciated body racked by the twin demons of opioid addiction and malnutrition. He refused to bathe or cut his hair, which grew into a long, matted mane that fell down his back. His beard became a wild, unkempt thicket, but the most visually arresting symbols of his decline were his fingernails and toenails. He forbade anyone from trimming them, and they grew into grotesque, yellowed talons, some curling into corkscrews several inches long, making simple tasks like holding an object almost impossible. His body was covered in bed sores from his relentless immobility, and he would urinate into empty bottles, carefully storing them along with his other waste in glass jars that he insisted on keeping nearby. This was the central, heartbreaking paradox of his existence. A man so pathologically terrified of invisible germs that he lived in a state of macroscopic filth and physical decay that would be considered abject poverty in any other context. Managing this bizarre and heartbreaking existence fell to a small, fiercely loyal, and well-compensated group of aides, often referred to as the Mormon Mafia. These men were not medical professionals. They were personal assistants, pilots, and handymen who found themselves as the sole intermediaries between Hughes and the outside world. Their duties extended far beyond the normal scope of employment into the realm of the surreal. They were governed by a strict, ever-evolving set of protocols designed to appease Hughes's obsessive-compulsive disorder. To hand him a single document, an aide was required to first cover his own hands with a stack of clean, white paper towels, creating a sterile barrier. Hughes himself would use wads of Kleenex to handle anything, his fingers encased in these paper shields to avoid direct contact. If an aide accidentally violated one of the countless unwritten rules, perhaps by making a slight noise or failing to approach from the correct angle, he could be summarily fired on the spot, only to often be rehired days later when Hughes's paranoia shifted to a new target. These men became the architects and guardians of his prison, their loyalty secured by enormous salaries and a profound sense of duty. Yet they were powerless to stop his decline, becoming unwitting accomplices in his self-destruction by faithfully executing his every irrational command. His diet became another theater for his compulsions, a source of immense anxiety and control. Hughes's eating habits were severely restricted and often bizarrely monotonous. For months, he might consume nothing but vanilla ice cream and canned peas, and then suddenly switch to a diet of only chicken soup or New York strip steak. The preparation of these simple meals was a ritual of immense complexity. He once issued a detailed, multi-page memorandum to his staff on the exact procedure for opening a can of fruit. The instructions were minute, specifying how to wash the can, where to puncture it, how to scrub the lid with soap and boiling water, and the precise angle to pour the contents to ensure no dust from the outside of the can could possibly contaminate the fruit inside. He became obsessed with the size of the peas he ate, insisting his aides use a special measuring tool to sort them by diameter, rejecting any that did not meet his exacting, arbitrary standard. This was not the fussiness of a gourmet. It was the behavior of a mind convinced that a single stray particle or a slightly oversized vegetable posed a lethal threat, a level of control that ultimately highlighted his complete and total loss of it. The tragic conclusion of this story underscores the most devastating irony of Howard Hughes's life. His billion-dollar fortune, which could have provided him with the finest medical care, the most luxurious comforts, and the greatest freedoms on earth, instead became the very instrument of his captivity. He used his wealth to build the walls of his isolation higher and thicker, to hire the enablers who followed his destructive orders, and to purchase the hotels he inhabited to ensure he would never be disturbed. Money provided the resources to perfectly craft his own hell. By the time he died in April 1976, during a flight from his penthouse in Acapulco to a hospital in Houston, he was a skeletal figure weighing less than 90 pounds, his body ravaged by kidney failure and years of neglect. He was so unrecognizable that authorities had to use his fingerprints for identification. The man who had once flown faster than anyone else on Earth, who had shaped industries and captivated the world, spent his final years as a prisoner of his own mind, his billionaire existence becoming indistinguishable from the most profound poverty of health, human connection, and hope. From the sterile, paranoid isolation of Howard Hughes, we journey to a world of flat-pack furniture and democratic design, to meet a billionaire whose thrift was not a symptom of mental illness, but a core, celebrated tenet of his corporate philosophy. If Hughes used his wealth to build a prison, Ingvar Kamprad used his to build an empire of affordability, and he lived by its principles with a consistency that both baffled and fascinated the world. The founder of IKEA was, for decades, one of the wealthiest people on the planet. Yet he was more likely to be spotted haggling at a local market than cruising in a private jet. His life presents a modern, almost corporate twist on our theme, where the line between billionaire and a modest, almost poor lifestyle was not just blurred, but systematically erased in the name of a larger ideal. Kamprad's relationship with money was forged in the stark landscape of his childhood in Småland, Sweden. This region was known for its hardscrabble farmland and a culture that revered resilience, resourcefulness, and thrift above all else. From a very young age, he displayed a precocious entrepreneurial spirit, but it was always tempered by this ingrained sense of frugality. His famous venture began not in a boardroom, but with a few simple products like pens, wallets, and picture frames, which he would sell to his neighbors, eventually expanding through a mail order catalog. The iconic IKEA name itself is an acronym from his own initials plus the farm and village where he grew up, Elmterred and Agunnaryd, a constant personal reminder of his humble origins. The foundational concept was always the same: to offer well-designed, functional products at the lowest possible price. This wasn't just a business strategy. For Kamprad, it was a moral crusade for democratic living, a mission to improve the daily lives of the many people. And he believed that mission could only be credible if he, the leader, embodied its core value of cost consciousness in his own life. This philosophy manifested in a personal lifestyle that seemed deliberately engineered to defy his billionaire status. He was famously photographed driving an ancient Volvo for decades, a car that became as much a part of his public image as the blue and yellow IKEA boxes. When he traveled, which he did frequently to visit his sprawling global empire, he almost always flew in the economy class cabin. He saw no contradiction in this, often telling interviewers that he was a bit tight with money, a statement that felt like a dramatic understatement. He would stay in budget hotels, eat at inexpensive restaurants, and was even known to reuse tea bags. On business trips, he would take public transportation from the airport and encourage his executives to do the same. In one particularly telling anecdote, after receiving a commendation from a business association in Switzerland, he decided the tram fare back to his hotel was an unnecessary expense and proceeded to walk instead. This wasn't a performance for the cameras. It was a deeply ingrained habit, a personal discipline that he had maintained since his youth and saw no reason to abandon, no matter how many billions he accumulated. His frugality extended into the most mundane corners of his existence, becoming a series of personal rituals. He was known to buy his clothes from flea markets, arguing that there was no logical reason to pay more for a shirt that served the same function. He would often visit IKEA stores not for grand inspections, but to have a cheap meal in the restaurant and to ensure the lights were turned off in empty rooms to save on electricity. He would meticulously write on both sides of a piece of paper before discarding it. In his later years, living in Switzerland, he would drive his old Volvo to the local market, specifically on Saturdays, because he knew that was when the vendors were most likely to lower their prices to sell off their remaining produce before the weekend closed. To an outside observer, these might seem like the actions of a miser, but for Kamprad, they were the logical, almost mathematical application of his life's work. Every krona saved was proof that the IKEA philosophy was not just a corporate slogan, but a living, breathing reality that started at the very top. This personal behavior was seamlessly integrated into the very DNA of his company, creating a unique corporate culture where thrift was a virtue, not a vice. He instilled in IKEA a principle he called the IKEA way, a set of values that celebrated simplicity and frowned upon extravagance. Employees at all levels were encouraged to be cost-conscious, not through miserly deprivation, but through smart, efficient choices that would ultimately benefit the customer. The now legendary practice of IKEA executives flying economy and staying in budget hotels on business trips was not a public relations stunt. It was a deeply embedded company policy that reflected its founders' own habits. The famous flat pack design, which revolutionized furniture and allowed for massive savings on shipping and storage, was the ultimate expression of this mindset. It was an innovative solution born from the desire to avoid waste and lower costs, a principle that Kamprad lived every day. He argued that wasting resources was a mortal sin, and he built a corporate culture where finding a smarter, cheaper way to do something was celebrated as a form of genius. Of course, this carefully crafted image of the humble billionaire was not without its complications and contradictions. For many years, Kamprad lived in Switzerland, a move that was widely interpreted as a form of tax avoidance for himself and the complex, labyrinthine ownership structure of the IKEA empire. This created a tension between the man who preached modesty and the financial architect, who had orchestrated a system to preserve his wealth from national treasuries. Furthermore, his youthful involvement with a Swedish fascist group in the 1940s remained a persistent and dark stain on his legacy, one he later described as the greatest mistake of his life. These facets reveal a more complex portrait than the simple folk hero of frugality. They suggest that his relationship with money and control was multifaceted, involving not just a personal disdain for lavish spending, but also a sophisticated and perhaps ruthless desire to protect and control the fortune he had built. The man who reused tea bags was also the man who oversaw one of the most Byzantine and secretive corporate ownership structures in the world. Ultimately, Ingvar Kamprad's life forces us to consider a different kind of billionaire poverty. It was not the desperate, imposed poverty of Sean Quinn, nor the spiritual terror of Sarah Winchester. It was a curated, ideological poverty, a performance of modesty that served a larger commercial and philosophical purpose. His thrift was the ultimate branding exercise, a living testament to the idea that IKEA was not just a store, but a belief system. By living a life that was visually indistinguishable from that of his most loyal customers, he built an unshakable bond of trust and authenticity. He proved that in the modern world, a billionaire's greatest power might not lie in the flaunting of wealth, but in the strategic, consistent, and very public rejection of its traditional displays. His legacy is a paradox that continues to shape our world. A colossal global fortune, built one saved krona at a time, by a man who believed that the best way to lead was to live as if he were no richer than the people he sought to serve. To understand why a man worth billions would drive a 20-year-old Volvo, we must travel to the stony farmland of Småland in southern Sweden, a place where the soil itself seems to teach lessons in resilience. Ingvar Kamprad wasn't just from this region. Its values were woven into his very being. Småland was historically a poor area where farmers had to wrest a living from a landscape littered with rocks and thin soil. This environment bred a culture that celebrated not just thrift, but a deeper, more profound principle they called dugtighet, a word that translates roughly to capability or resourcefulness. It wasn't about being cheap. It was about being smart, about making the absolute most of every single resource available, because waste was not just a financial misstep. It was a moral failure against. the backdrop of a hard land. From his earliest days, Kamprad was immersed in this worldview. His grandmother would save and reuse even the smallest pieces of string, and his aunt would meticulously darn socks until they could no longer be repaired. These weren't acts of poverty, but of principle, a deep-seated belief that taking care of what you have and using it fully is a form of respect, both for the object and for the labor that created it. This upbringing became the fertile ground for his entrepreneurial spirit, which sprouted almost as soon as he could walk. As a young boy, he discovered he could buy matches in bulk from Stockholm and sell them individually to his neighbors at a small profit, saving them a trip and providing himself with pocket money. He quickly expanded his miniature empire to include fish, Christmas decorations, and pens, all sold from his bicycle. The key to his success, even then, was the same principle that would define IKEA: find a way to offer a needed product at a lower price. He wasn't just selling things, he was selling efficiency and affordability. The famous IKEA, a name itself, an acronym of his own initials coupled with Elmturrid, the family farm, and Agonarid, his home village, was a constant public homage to these roots. It was as if he was branding his global enterprise with a promise never to forget where he came from, to always carry the resourceful spirit of the Småland farmer into every boardroom and every store. This personal ethos did not remain a private matter. It became the very backbone of IKEA's corporate identity, creating a culture so unique it became known simply as the IKEA way. Kamprad codified this philosophy in his manifesto, a furniture dealer's testament, where he explicitly laid out commandments like wasting resources is a mortal sin and simplicity is a virtue. But this, far more than a list of inspiring quotes for a breakroom poster. It was a practical, actionable guide that dictated everything from how executives traveled to how a product was designed. The now legendary flat pack concept is the ultimate expression of this. The story goes that in the early 1950s, an IKEA employee removed the legs of a table to fit it into a customer's car, and a revolution was born. Kamprad and his team realized that designing furniture to be packed flat would massively reduce shipping volume, lower storage costs, and minimize damage. This single, brilliant innovation, born entirely from the desire to avoid waste, allowed IKEA to slash prices dramatically, passing the savings directly to the customer. It was Duktig, hit on a global scale, a smarter, more resourceful solution that benefited everyone. The expectation that leaders must embody this frugality was non-negotiable. IKEA executives were not just encouraged, but expected to fly economy class and stay in budget hotels. When they traveled on business, they were to use public transportation whenever possible. This was not a public relations stunt. It was a fundamental test of character and commitment. Kamprad believed that a leader who indulged in first-class luxuries could never truly understand or champion the company's core mission of creating a better everyday life for the many people. How could you credibly design an affordable kitchen if you never had to consider the cost of a cabinet? This created a powerful sense of shared purpose and solidarity within the company, breaking down the traditional barriers between the corporate suite and the shop floor. Employees saw that the bosses were subject to the same rules, fostering a culture where cost consciousness was not about pinching pennies, but about a collective dedication to the company's democratic mission. And Kamprad himself was the ultimate role model, living a life that seemed to defy the very concept of billionaire status. His infamous old Volvo was more than just a car. It was a rolling symbol of his consistency. He would proudly tell reporters that he hoped to drive it for another 20 years. He shopped at flea markets for his clothes, not as a quirky hobby, but because he genuinely saw no logic in paying more for a shirt that served the same function as a cheaper one. Even in his later years, living in Switzerland, he would time his grocery shopping for the late afternoon on Saturdays, knowing that was when the market vendors would be most willing to discount their produce before closing for the weekend. He reused tea bags and wrote on both sides of a piece of paper. To an outsider, these might seem like the eccentric habits of a miser, but for those who understood his philosophy, they were profound declarations of integrity. He was proving every single day that his belief in resourcefulness was not a corporate marketing strategy, but his authentic personal creed. In a world where extreme wealth often leads to extreme disconnect, Ingvar Kamprad remained in his daily habits, remarkably and genuinely relatable to the millions of customers who walked through the blue and yellow doors of his stores. Charles Feeney's commitment to giving wasn't just about moving money from one column to another. It was about strategically targeting his resources to create seismic shifts in specific, vital areas of human need, transforming his foundation, Atlantic Philanthropies, into a powerful engine of change. His approach was deeply analytical, focusing on leverage of finding the precise point where a grant could unlock a much larger transformation. Nowhere was this more evident than in his monumental support for education. He didn't just write checks to his alma mater, Cornell University. He executed one of the largest gifts in the history of higher education, ultimately donating over $1 billion to the institution. But these were not unrestricted donations for a new building with his name on it. He insisted on anonymity and strategically directed his gifts to spark matching funds from other donors, effectively doubling or even tripling the impact. His funding was targeted to build world-class research facilities, attract top-tier faculty, and most importantly, open the doors of opportunity through scholarships for countless students who would otherwise never have had the chance. He applied this same strategic lens globally, pouring hundreds of millions into universities in Ireland, Australia, Vietnam, and South Africa, fundamentally strengthening their capacity for research and education, with the explicit goal of building intellectual capital and fostering the next generation of leaders in regions poised for growth. His philanthropic vision extended far beyond the lecture hall, making historic investments in the fundamental pillars of human dignity, health, and civil rights. In health, Atlantic Philanthropies was a driving force behind the global movement for tobacco control, funding advocacy and research that led to life-saving public health policies worldwide. They invested hundreds of millions into biomedical research, particularly in neuroscience and aging, aiming to tackle diseases that affect millions. But perhaps one of his most impactful and politically courageous investments was in the pursuit of peace and human rights. For decades, Atlantic Philanthropies was one of the largest funders of civil society groups in Northern Ireland, quietly supporting organizations that worked across sectarian divides. This long-term patient capital was instrumental in building the infrastructure for peace that underpinned the Good Friday Agreement, demonstrating Feeney's belief that philanthropy could play a role in healing even the most entrenched conflicts. Similarly, in the United States, he was a major early funder of the movement for affordable health care, supporting the campaign that ultimately led to the Affordable Care Act, and he backed organizations fighting for the rights of marginalized communities, including immigrants and LGBTQ+ individuals. These were not safe, uncontroversial causes. They were strategic bets on a more just and equitable society, reflecting a profound belief that health and human rights are the essential foundations upon which all other progress is built. The true measure of Charles Feeney's philosophy, however, may lie not just in the billions he gave away, but in the profound influence he exerted on the very culture of modern wealth. For years, he operated in the shadows, a ghost at the banquet of billionaires, proving that immense generosity could be divorced from the hunger for public acclaim. When his identity was finally revealed in 1997, it sent a shockwave through the world of philanthropy. Here was a living, breathing counterexample to the traditional model of the wealthy patriarch who clings to his fortune until death. His very existence became a powerful argument for the giving while living philosophy, and it caught the attention of the two most prominent billionaires on the planet, Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. Buffett, in particular, has been explicit about Feeney's influence, calling him a hero and a model. Feeney's demonstration that you could not only give your wealth away, but do so with immense joy and satisfaction within your lifetime, provided a tangible, successful blueprint. It helped catalyze their thinking, which culminated in the creation of the Giving Pledge in 2010, the historic campaign that encourages the world's wealthiest individuals to commit the majority of their wealth to philanthropic causes. The launch of the Giving Pledge was, in many ways, the ultimate validation of Feeney's life's work. While he was never a signatory, having already given away the vast majority of his wealth by the time it was founded, his spirit is woven into its very fabric. Gates and Buffett didn't just admire his generosity. They saw in his method a solution to a fundamental problem, the hoarding of capital that could be actively solving the world's most pressing issues. Feeney proved that the donor, while alive, could be more effective, learning from successes and failures, adapting strategies, and witnessing the tangible results of their generosity. This stands in stark contrast to the traditional, slow-moving foundation model that often only disperses a small percentage of its assets each year. By inspiring this broader movement, Feeney's impact became exponential. The hundreds of billionaires who have now taken the pledge, from Mackenzie Scott to Mark Zuckerberg, are part of a philanthropic sea change that he helped initiate, potentially unlocking trillions of dollars for charitable causes decades earlier than would have otherwise happened. His legacy, therefore, is a double helix: the direct, monumental good accomplished by his $8 billion in giving, and the incalculable ripple effect good inspired by his example, which continues to redirect the flow of global wealth toward the service of humanity. He redefined the purpose of a fortune, transforming it from a monument to oneself into a dynamic, living force for progress, proving that the most meaningful wealth is not what you have, but what you give away. We have journeyed through the extraordinary lives of individuals who occupied two diametrically opposed worlds, their stories united by a single, powerful paradox: the immense wealth they possessed, and the profound poverty they experienced. From the frantic hoarding of Hetty Green, driven by a terror of loss seared into her by childhood trauma, to the silent, deliberate exile of Huguette Clark, who sought refuge from her inheritance within the sterile walls of a hospital room. We witnessed Aristotle Onassis, who built a shipping empire as an unbreachable fortress against the memory of being a penniless refugee, and the tragic self-imprisonment of Howard Hughes, whose wealth built the walls of a germ-free cage that could not protect him from his own mind. We saw the philosophical austerity of Ingvar Kamprad, whose thrift was a corporate creed, and the strategic dissolution of Charles Feeney's fortune, given away with quiet urgency to heal and educate the world. And we encountered those for whom poverty was a cruel twist of fate, from the genteel deprivation of Prince Heinrich the 24th, a man out of time, to the catastrophic financial free fall of Sean Quinn, whose empire vanished in a cloud of market speculation. Each story, in its own unique way, forces us to challenge our most basic assumptions about wealth. We often think of money as a tool for freedom, a means to security, comfort, and choice. Yet, for so many of these individuals, their fortunes became a source of profound confinement. It fueled anxieties, dictated bizarre rituals, enforced isolation, and became a burden as heavy as any chains. Their lives powerfully illustrate that the value of money is not absolute. It is entirely dependent on the psychological and philosophical framework of the person who holds it. $1 billion can be the key to a prison cell just as easily as it can be the key to a palace. The true poverty many of them faced was not a lack of currency, but a scarcity of peace, a deficit of trust, or a famine of the spirit that no amount of financial capital could ever replenish. So, as we reflect on these paradoxical lives, from the Gilded Age to the modern era, we are left with a question that transcends their individual stories and speaks directly to our own values. If wealth can so easily distort, isolate, and even destroy, then what truly constitutes a rich life? Is it the fearless accumulation and protective hoarding of resources, the quiet, anonymous deployment of those resources for the good of others, or perhaps something entirely separate from financial standing altogether? Life rich in connection, purpose, and inner peace that remains untouched by the fluctuations of a bank account. The stories you've heard today are not merely bizarre footnotes in history. They are profound, real-world experiments in the human relationship with money. We want to hear which of these narratives resonated most deeply with you and why. Did Charles Feeney's radical generosity redefine wealth for you? Or did Howard Hughes's tragic isolation serve as the more powerful cautionary tale? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's continue this fascinating conversation about what it truly means to be wealthy and what any of us would be willing to trade for a life of genuine contentment.